that. But in the event of war, why should it be an American war, made up largely of American troops, American casualties, and American deaths? We hope there is no war, but if there is, we hope and pray that it will not be prolonged with casualties. Certainly, the United States has a high responsibility to lead the international community in opposing aggression. This should not require the United States to assume a greater burden and a greater responsibility than other nations with an equal or even greater stake in the resolution of the crisis. That's what's happening, and it's wrong. It may become necessary to use force to expel Iraq and Kuwait. But because war is such a grave undertaking with such serious consequences, we must make certain that war is employed only as a last resort. War carries with it great costs and high risks, an unknown number of casualties and deaths, billions of dollars spent, greatly disrupt oil supply and oil price increases, a war possibly wide to Israel, Turkey, or other allies, the possible long-term American occupation of Iraq, increased instability in the Persian Gulf region, long-lasting Arab enmity against the United States, a possible return to isolationism at home. The grave decision of war is being made prematurely. This is hard to understand. The administration has yet to explain why war is necessary now. Just a couple of months ago, the administration itself said that sanctions and diplomacy were the proper course. There has been no clear rationale, no convincing explanation for drifting American policy from one of sanctions to one of war. The policy of economic and diplomatic sanctions was the president's policy. He and other administration officials repeatedly called it the best policy to pursue. They described positively the effect that the sanctions were having on Iraq. President Bush told a joint session of Congress in September that these sanctions are working. Iraq is feeling heat. Iraq's leaders are cut off from world trade, unable to sell their oil, and only a tiny fraction of goods through. Those were the president's words. In October, Secretary of State Baker said sanctions must remain the focus of American efforts. He said, and I quote, "We must exercise patience as the grip of sanctions tightens with increasing severity." According to CIA Director William Webster, the policy of sanctions is dealing a serious blow to the Iraqi economy. In December, he testified that all sectors of the Iraqi economy are feeling the pinch of sanctions, and many industries have largely shut down. The President's initial policy against Iraq to impose international sanctions and to enforce them using all necessary means is working, as CIA Director Webster has detailed. He and others have noted that more than 90% of Iraq's imports and 97% of its exports have been stopped. Industrial production in Iraq has declined by 40% since August. Many industries, including Iraq's only tire manufacturer, have either closed or sharply reduced production due to the shortage of industrial imports. The flow of spare parts and military supplies from the Soviet Union and France, Iraq's major suppliers, has stopped. Iraq's foreign exchange reserves have diminished drastically, hindering its ability to purchase goods from smugglers. Food prices have skyrocketed. The Iraqi government has cut rations twice and has confiscated food on the open market. Agricultural production has been weakened by the departure of foreign labor. Lines have appeared at government distribution points for natural gas. Clearly, this policy is not failing. It is having a significant effect on Iraq. Yet soon after the November 8th decision to deploy additional troops to the Persian Gulf, administration officials suddenly began expressing skepticism about whether the sanctions would have the desired effect. They argued that time was not on our side, that the Iraqi military would be able to strengthen its position in Kuwait. Not only are these arguments opposite, but the same people saying earlier, they are also consistent with the assessment and projections of Central Intelligence Agency. Director Webster told the Congress in December that continued sanctions will have an increasingly damaging effect not only on the Iraqi economy, but also on the Iraqi military, weakening it over time. The CIA estimated that continued sanctions will result in the virtual depletion of Iraq's foreign exchange reserves by spring, multiplying economic problems as Iraq transfers more resources to the military. The shutdown of nearly all but energy-related and military industries by summer. Increasing inflation combined with reduced rations. A severe reduction in basic commodities such as cooking oils and sugar. A reduction in the grain supply by half. These effects will certainly weaken the Iraqi regime and degrade Iraq's military capabilities. A decrease in the Iraqi Air Force's ability to fly regular missions after 3 to 6 months due to dependent on foreign equipment and technicians. A deterioration of the readiness of Iraq's ground and air forces after 9 months. A reduction in the Iraqi military's transport and mobility capabilities due to shortages of critical supplies. Given these effects of continued sanctions against Iraq, it is clear that time is on the side of the international coalition. But the anticipation of war has obscured a rational analysis of the initial policy set forth by the President. It's significant that even the administration cannot and does not say that the policy of sanctions has failed. To this moment, neither the President nor any member of his administration has said that sanctions have failed. In response to my direct question just a few days ago, both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense acknowledged that sanctions have not failed. But, they say, they cannot guarantee that sanctions will get Iraq out of Kuwait by January 15th. Of course, no one has ever asked for such a guarantee. Those who advocate continuing the policy of sanctions recognize that it does not guarantee success by January 15th or any other time certain. It involves a risk. The risk is that the international coalition will fall apart before Iraq leaves Kuwait. Prematurely abandoning the sanctions and immediately going to war also involves risk. The risk there is almost human life. How many people will die? How many young Americans will die? That's a risk, a terrible risk. Just this morning, I heard it said that there may be only a few thousand American casualties. But for the families of those few thousand, the fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, daughters and sons, the word only will have no meaning. And the truly haunting question, which no one will ever be able to answer, will be, did they die unnecessarily? But if we go to war now, no one will ever know if sanctions would have worked if given a full and fair chance. The reality is that no course of action is free of risk. The prudent course now is to continue the President's initial policy of economic sanctions. Time to fortify Iraq's defenses will do little good if some of Iraq's planes can't fly for lack of spare parts, if some of its tanks can't move for lack of lubricant, if its infrastructure and ability to wage war has been weakened. If it eventually becomes necessary for the United States to wage war, troops would have benefited from the additional time given for sanctions to degrade Iraq's military capabilities. The sanctions are being enforced. They are having an effect on Iraq. We should continue their enforcement and seek to enlarge their effect. I believe the best course now for the President and for the nation is to stay the course, to continue the policy the President so clearly established at the outset of the crisis. It offers the best hope now for the achievement of our objectives at the lowest cost in lives and treasure. That is a goal we all share. Mr. President.
Leader,
For a question. Yes, certainly. Mr. President, the leader very dramatically said the key question, did they die unnecessarily? As I read this resolution should be adopted. It would clearly indicate that the Congress is not unified with the President. Congress is not unified with the United Nations. And therefore, Saddam Hussein have a basis to seek the avenue for as long as he wishes to avoid the goal which I understand the leader says concurs in, namely to evacuate Kuwait. But back to this phrase, did they die unnecessarily? How carefully did the leader and your colleagues weigh this historic opportunity for the Congress of the United States to join and send a unified message to Saddam Hussein by standing with the President and with the United Nations in hopes that that unified message tilts the balance and induce them to evacuate and avoid the use of force and death unnecessarily. We'll read that very carefully. Thank you.
Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President.
Would Vermont just yield briefly? I want to congratulate the Majority Leader on an excellent statement. Thank you for his working on this resolution, which he introduced on behalf of many of us who worked on it. It has been a very difficult process in getting agreement. I would hope that there would be others who would take a look at the resolution on both sides of the aisle. Certainly we'll be looking at the resolution introduced by the Republicans by the aisle. It's a matter of grave importance to our country, to our people, to the young men and women who serve in the military and particularly the station there. I want to thank the Majority Leader for his leadership and congratulate him on an excellent statement which begins this debate by asking the right questions and by putting it in the right framework. I will have a statement later this afternoon. I'm nursing a case of laryngitis, and so if I find a little quiet time, I can get my voice back and we'll be speaking on this subject. But I do think it's a very important time in the United States Senate and the nation. It's important not only because of what's going on in the East. It's important, as the Majority Leader said at the beginning of the statement, to our system of government. And I think that the people in the Middle East who are listening to this debate, particularly those in Iraq, particularly Saddam Hussein, should not make any mistake about this debate. This is democracy. This is our system of government. The question is not whether Iraq gets out of Kuwait. They will and they must. The question is not whether we agree with President Bush's goals. We do. The real question is how we go about it. Whether we actually use military force or whether we use the embargo. In either of them, the Iraqis must get out of Kuwait. In either case, Saddam Hussein loses, and I think that message should go out. We will, of course, as in any debate, be emphasizing the differences. No one should lose sight of the fact that we all, Democrats and Republicans, and I think the nation, agree on the overall goals, and that should not be lost in the cloud of debate.
President, I thank the Senator for his comments, and I share his view, and I wish to reaffirm it, that there are many things about which I am in doubt. I'm in doubt as to the outcome of this debate. I'm in doubt as to votes, and anyone who works in the Senate is in doubt about the will of the Senate on many occasions. But there is one thing on which I have no doubt whatsoever, and that is that Iraq will leave Kuwait. There is no doubt in my mind. There can be no doubt in any senator's mind on that point. Iraq will leave Kuwait. One way or the other, Iraq will leave Kuwait. We are united on that point. We disagree, as Senator Knight suggested, on the means best suited to achieve the objective at the lowest cost. And I hope that everyone understands that is what the issue is, and is the context in which the debate will be conducted.
Mr. President. Mr. President.
Distinguished Senator from Vermont.
Mr. President, I commend the distinguished majority leader for his comprehensive and clear statement. I commend the distinguished senior senator from Georgia, the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, for his statement. Mr. President, if I could just reiterate what the distinguished senator from Maine, Mr. Mitchell, said. We are united on the goal that Iraq must leave Kuwait. It cannot be given, in effect, given a reward for its naked aggression. But I would hope that every single senator, Republican and Democrat, and every single member of the other body be united on one overriding factor. The Constitution is extremely clear that the Congress, and only the Congress, can declare war. That the votes that we cast today must ultimately lead to the decision, are we declaring war or not? If we ignore the Constitution in this regard, at a time nearly 500,000 American troops are poised, heavily armed, in Saudi Arabia, if we ignore that, then we set a precedent that says that in the most powerful nation known in history, one person, whoever is president, has the sole power to unleash that enormous power in a war that could engulf any part of the world. That one person alone could commit the treasures, the people, the abilities, the life of our nation to war solely on his decision. The Constitution does not say that. And for 200 years it said that the Congress would declare war. The President would carry out such a war. And that's really what we're deciding today. I could not imagine any democracy long surviving that did not adhere to such a principle. As the Founding Fathers said at the time of the Constitutional Convention, to do otherwise, to put all the power in one person, would to in effect have an elected monarch. Nobody, Republican, Democrat, in the Congress or in the administration or anywhere in our country, should want that conclusion. The Constitution stands above all else. Today, Mr. President, the Senate is engaged in a historic debate on one of the most fundamental decisions that can come before the United States government. Shall this nation commit its armed force to war against another country? As already stated, as the majority leader has stated, and as the distinguished senior senator from Georgia has stated, there's no disagreement between the President and the Congress that Iraq's aggression against Kuwait must not be allowed to stand. Certainly, nobody in Iraq, from Saddam Hussein down, could ever discern disagreement on that. The government stands united, both in the legislative branch and the executive branch, that Iraq's aggression against Kuwait will not be allowed to stand. But this agreement between the President and the Congress is not about restoring the Emir of Kuwait to his throne or returning democracy to Kuwait. Kuwait was not a democratic nation before the invasion, and restoration of a family to its palaces and pleasures is not worth one American life. Or is the agreement about preserving low oil prices to maintain prosperity of the industrialized countries. If anything, continued American and Western dependence on Persian Gulf oil is an indictment of the lack of a serious energy policy over the last decade. Neither Congress nor the American people should support war for cheap oil, especially when that cheap oil would go primarily to those countries that are doing precious oil to help. No, Mr. President, the agreement is about stopping the use of brute force by the strong against the weak. Saddam Hussein is striving for regional hegemony with the use of force. If collective security under the United Nations is to replace the law of the jungle in international relations, if we are to emerge from the Cold War with a better and more stable international community, what Saddam Hussein has done cannot be left unchallenged. President Bush displayed brilliant diplomacy in uniting the world community against Saddam Hussein and marshaling strong coalition force in Saudi Arabia, and in obtaining the United Nations approval, the most comprehensive embargo against a nation in history. President Bush's leadership in securing a United Nations authorization for the use of force to compel Iraq to leave Kuwait if necessary is a triumph for the role and authority of the United Nations in establishing collective security as a basis for international relations. Up until the decision announced November 8 to alter the character of U.S. policy in the Desert Shield operation, the President had enjoyed bipartisan support in Congress and among the American people for his actions to deter further Iraqi aggression, bring together a multinational coalition against Saddam Hussein. But since then, a gap between the President and many in Congress has appeared. We have to ask what happened to produce this unfortunate division between the President and a large part of the Congress. Mr. President, we know this divergence has come about. But let nobody think that the divergence is a consequence of disagreement on goals. All agree that the United States, the world community, must stand against the destruction of a sovereign nation, in this case, a full member of the United Nations. In fact, failure to act decisively against the siege of Kuwait could destroy the chance for a fundamental change in the forms of international behavior. In my judgment, Mr. President, the disagreement that we see is the result of far different perceptions of the right course of action to attain what really are shared goals in the Persian Gulf. Now, the President clearly has concluded that only force can compel Saddam Hussein to leave Kuwait. He's no longer prepared to employ an international quarantine of this outlaw regime to enforce far-reaching sanctions and to maintain an adequate deterrent force to prevent further aggression. As I said over and over, on the floor and in my own state of mind, I commend the President's diplomacy and leadership in the crisis. But I must say it is not at all clear to me that he and his advisors have clearly thought through the risk of war and also what happens in its aftermath once we win. Once we start, for example, what are our aims? Do we intend only to liberate Kuwait and then stop? What happens in the case if the Iraqis refuse to stop fighting? Does the war go on to totally destroy their military might? Or will we drive on Baghdad and destroy the Saddam Hussein regime? The statements we've heard from the administration seem to imply that. But then what does victory mean for the regional balance of power, especially if we have to destroy the Iraqi military machine as well as the Saddam Hussein regime? After all, only 5 months ago, the administration was actually supporting Saddam Hussein in Iraq as he counterfeit to Iran. I remember very well, Mr. President, during the time the Farm Bill was on the floor for debate. Most senators wanted to put sanctions against Iraq because of their human rights violations. You may well recall when that happened. Even as Iraqi tanks were amassing to go into Kuwait, the administration was up here lobbying against any sanctions against Iraq. This the same regime we're ready to go to war against months later. And if we really thought through the consequences of Syria and emerging as a dominant regional power, both these countries are anti-democratic and anti-Western. They're fundamentally hostile to other moderate Arab regimes such as Egypt and Saudi Arabia. They're opposed to the United States ally Israel. What are the prospects for long-term regional stability if these powers dominate the Middle East? I'm also concerned about the potential explosion of terrorism, including techno-terrorism, or erupts. And if we carefully analyze the risks of worldwide terrorism, ways to defend against it, I do not see much evidence that a great deal of thought has been given to this as we move toward war. Frankly, I have the distinct impression that policy making for all crises has been largely in the hands of the President and a few of his closest advisors. The professional diplomats and experts in the Middle East seem to have been on the sidelines. I do not think there has been serious study and analysis of alternatives and possible outcomes. Mr. President, I fear that sometimes we react to these events, and the decisions get made after the latest round of cables and news broadcasts. We should not substitute for planning for the long-term best interests of the United States. Now, as I understand the President's thinking, and I've been in many meetings of the congressional leadership with the President on this issue over the last several months, the President believes the sanctions will take far too long, if ever, to force Saddam Hussein to comply with the United Nations resolutions directing Iraq's withdrawal from Kuwait. Now, clearly the President's concerns are not to be taken lightly. I do wish to commend President Bush for the consulting he has done. In my 16 years I've been here, I have not seen a President take so much time to personally consult with members of Congress in both parties in both houses as President Bush has. When you look at his concerns, let me try to express them on sanctions. Multinational coalition arrayed against Iraq is dispelled. It would be hard to hold together such a diverse group of nations pursuing many different objectives and interests. Nor can we discount the difficulty and costs of maintaining comprehensive sanctions for months, perhaps even years. There's going to be increasing temptations to violate the sanctions. Leakages will occur. Sanctions are very burdensome to many nations now participating in the coalition against Iraq. And many privately and sometimes publicly express their concerns about those burdens. And finally, we have to frankly recognize the many political, military, and financial costs of keeping a strong deterrent force in Saudi Arabia to buttress sanctions and also to make the threat of force as sanctions eventually prove insufficient to achieve our aims. But despite these serious arguments, many of us in Congress continue to believe the President was on the course prior to November 8th, and he's moved in the wrong direction since that time. Repeatedly, I've warned and urged the President not to go to war out of impatience, or said that it's easier to start a war than to stop one. And I've asked him to consider the consequences of war and its aftermath for the long-term interests of the United States and the Arab world. Here's what I understood American policy to be prior to November 8th. Then the policy I strongly supported. Firm determination to compel the evacuation of Kuwait, to free the hostages, and to deter further aggression. And deployment of sufficient American and other forces to protect Saudi Arabia. To make credible the opportunity to use force should that prove necessary. Application of comprehensive economic and political sanctions against Iraq, as long as it might take, to make the cost of its occupation of Kuwait exceed any benefits it might gain. And unification of the world community, the United Nations behind policy, including endorsement of sanctions, and if necessary to get our goals, the use of force. Now, this policy has already secured 2 of the 3 lanes. It's deterred an attack on Saudi Arabia, nobody can doubt that. And we set hostages free. So what has happened to change my support? I believe we've seen the abandonment of strategy of strict enforcement of comprehensive sanctions to weaken and undermine the Saddam Hussein regime such that it had to withdraw. Purpose and character of American deployment in Saudi Arabia have been altered from deterrence defense to that of offensive action. And the President moved a policy of use of force to compel Iraqi evacuation of Kuwait, saying the date of January 15 is a deadline for Iraqi compliance with the United Nations resolution. Now, Mr. President, the President Bush is right not to base United States policy on public opinion polls. There's far too much willingness in both the executive and the legislative branch of the government these days to shift course according to which way the polls go that day. Sometimes it's necessary. If you want to carry out the responsibilities that are conferred upon us, that we're all sworn to uphold, to make decisions that are ostensibly at odds with public opinion polls. At the same time, we are in a democracy. And government is supposed to express the will of the people. And no matter is this principle more evident and more compelling than in a decision to commit this nation to war. Why the Constitution makes it very clear. The democratic process must be used in a declaration of war. For war is born by the people. It is sons and daughters of the American people, our constituents, who have to do the fighting and the dying. We have an obligation to reflect the will of the people in this most fundamental decision. Politically, morally, and even militarily, we must not go to war if it is not supported by the American people. Vietnam proved that truth after moral and human, financial, and diplomatic costs to the United States. Now, I have little doubt about the views of Vermont. Ever since this crisis began, I've traveled throughout my state. I asked Vermonters their views on the Persian Gulf crisis. And their reactions mirror my own. That the President was on the right track up to November 8th, but his move towards war before sanctions have had a full opportunity to Iraq is wrong. And Vermont also agree. Whether they are in favor of going to war or opposed, they agree with the necessity for Congress to be part of the decision on whether or not their sons and daughters will go to war. And they do have, in this regard, the Constitution on their side. Hearings this week in the Judiciary Committee with some of the most eminent constitutional scholars and legal authorities in the country merely added to my own firm conclusion that no president has the authority to initiate war with the approval of Congress. Let me emphasize that most basic point, Mr. President. Under the Constitution, the President does not have the authority to initiate war without the approval of Congress. To say otherwise would say in this country, the most powerful nation on earth, a nation of 250 million people, that one person could commit that power, whatever he may wish. No one person should have such awesome power as to send American men and women to war, or death or maiming. Founding fathers understood the centrality of this truth of democracy. They specifically reserved to Congress the power to declare war. The President's power is also great, but it is limited to the duty and authority as Commander-in-Chief to the direct conduct of war after a declaration of war or other act by Congress. So in this debate, we in the Senate are performing one of the most important responsibilities conferred upon us by the Constitution. We must act. There are perhaps some who wish to vote one way or the other on this because there's probably no hope. The member of Congress will cast in his or her career. There will be more remembered by his or her constituents than this one. But we not only take our responsibility, we violate the oath of upholding the Constitution if we do not vote and if we do not act. To hide behind the United Nations resolution, however valuable in the world community, that would be abrogation of our constitutional obligation. To take refuge by voting on a vaguely worded endorsement of the President's actions until now, no more, is to evade our duty to the American people. Talk about the United Nations resolution. That cannot substitute for the Constitution. That resolution was voted on by many countries who will not bear the burden the United States will. Our Constitution stands supreme to the United Nations resolution or to anything else. Now, it's often said that Congress likes to criticize, not to take a clear stand. I do not want there to be any misunderstanding or ambiguity about where I stand today. Vermonters and indeed the American people have a right to know exactly where I stand as a United States Senator on the central issue. I'll state my position. The case for war now has not been made by the President. I see no justification for young men and women of the United States war. Sanctions have been given an adequate amount of time to undermine Iraqi armed forces for Saddam Hussein's regime. 5 months is not long enough to degrade the Iraqi war machine or weaken the economy such that Saddam Hussein might think the cost too great to remain in Kuwait. We should continue to deploy an adequate American deterrent force in Saudi Arabia during the time sanctions are being applied. These forces are necessary to make credible the option which retains an option for ultimate resort to war. So I will vote against the declaration of war or other congressional authorization of the use of force now. Nor am I prepared to support the use of force before sanctions have been applied for sufficient time to damage Iraq. Now, I've heard criticism of views like mine. Critics say that we're undermining the President's diplomacy to make such a credible threat of war that Saddam Hussein will be frightened into withdrawing from Kuwait. I'll say the multinational coalition will not hold together for the months or years it might take for sanctions to work. They will argue that the United States cannot afford to maintain the 100,000, 200,000 troops in Saudi Arabia to preserve the option of force. And Mr. President, I don't accept these arguments. The President can threaten war as part of his diplomacy, but our Constitution gives only to Congress the power to declare war. We'll never support or accede to sacrifice the principles of the Constitution to assist anyone's diplomacy. We are stronger as a nation for democratic debate and adherence to our Constitution. Diplomacy must accommodate itself to the Constitution, not the other way around. This is the strength of the multinational coalition. Each of these nations share substantial interest in unified action against Iraq, and thus will remain committed, or they cannot. Once again, I cannot acquiesce in ignoring the Constitution of the United States in the interest of harmony of the multinational coalition. I see no reason whatever to prevent us from maintaining credible military options in Saudi Arabia for the foreseeable future. Mr. President, we kept over 250,000 troops in Europe for nearly 40 years to deter Soviet aggression. We've kept troops in South Korea for nearly as long, equally for Japan. If we determine that it's in the national interest, we could make the financial sacrifices, we could rotate troops, we can keep them fresh, their morale high. It would cost a lot more to carry out a war than to maintain a smaller deterrent force while sanctions are carried out. But than that, even that is only money. Real savings from waste is in lives saved. So let the Senate do its duty. Every senator stand up and say clearly where he or she stands. Then we must vote so that we will be accountable to the American people, together with the President, for what happens in the Persian Gulf. And now one final thing. This is perhaps the most important debate that I've been involved in the 16 years that I've served here in this body. We're debating whether the United States troops will be ordered into battle. I spent an awful lot of time thinking about this. I've read everything I could about it. I've appreciated the briefings with the President, the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. And I've listened to other senators, Republicans and Democrats alike. And I've dealt personally with the Persian Gulf crisis. I think perhaps what has been most worthwhile to me, hundreds and hundreds of Vermonters I've talked with around our conservatives, liberals, moderates, political, some lie themselves with one political party, the others with none, from all walks of life, rich, poor, old, young. And I come to this conclusion from all of those views. I have no doubt President Bush wants a peaceful resolution to this conflict. He clearly believes that policy is the best means to get Saddam Hussein out of Iraq. But the President and I disagree on how best to achieve this. We have a constitutional obligation. Vote the way I feel I should in this. Having spent hours searching my soul, I must conclude that we must be firm and patient. I've concluded war should not be the first resort. It should be the last resort. Now is not the time for war. I will vote against war. President, I yield to you.
Mr. President.
Senator from Illinois.
Mr. President, first I'd like to ask unanimous consent to be added as a co-sponsor of the resolution.
Without objection.
Mr. President, there is a grim mood here in Congress, as I do not recall. When you and I were elected to the House, Mr. President, in 1974, we were already involved in the Vietnam War. It was being pulled on. I have not experienced this kind of a mood before in Washington, D.C. We faced unprovoked aggression, no question about it. And there is no question in the minds of anyone here that Saddam Hussein and the Iraqi troops have to get out of Kuwait one way or another. And the attempt yesterday by the Iraqi foreign minister to shift this in some kind of fight for the Palestinians against Israel is pure public relations hogwash. The Iraqis invaded Kuwait simply out of greed. No question about it. We have to send a message to Saddam Hussein, and to military dictators, anyone who can't move in, take over your country. And I might add, that's the only reason for being there. The reason of oil, the reason of defending American values, job creation, these are things I hear, they're not adequate reasons for American troops being there. Saddam Hussein controlled not only the oil of Iraq and Kuwait, but also Saudi Arabia. He can't drink that oil. He can't sit on that oil. He has to sell the oil. So the oil reason isn't a valid reason for being there. Now, what do we do about seeing that we get Iraqi troops out of Kuwait? There are three options. The diplomatic option, the economic option with sanctions, and the military option. And we examine all three. And let me add, I think the President of the United States handled the situation superbly up until November 8th, days after the election. And I think it is significant that the change in policy came 2 days after the election without, so far as we know, consultation with a single member of Congress. The diplomatic front, what is happening is discouraging. The diplomatic effort to get Iraqi troops out of Kuwait appears to be failing. We hope the Secretary General of the United Nations can be persuasive, but I don't think anyone here is optimistic. I think two mistakes, however, have been made, and I mention this simply so that we don't repeat mistakes in the future. Number one, the President has said no negotiation. My friends, there are only two options. You negotiate or have war. John F. Kennedy was right when he said, never negotiate out of fear, but never fear to negotiate. We have to sit down and talk to people to work out solutions. Now, you don't negotiate away something that is basic. Part of what is basic, for example, is simply that all Iraqi troops have to get out of Kuwait. But let's not start creating something so that the word negotiate is like a bad word. And the second mistake that's made is not giving Saddam some kind of way out, some relief. I think we disagree on what the relief ought to be. When you grow up in rural America and live in rural America, you learn something very simple. Don't corner a rattlesnake. Give the rattlesnake a way to get out. And that's what we have to do in the situation over there. But I have to say, the diplomatic option looks very, very difficult. The second option is the economic option, sanctions. This was imposed by the President and Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense appear to have all but given up on this. And I suggest the evidence is pretty overwhelming that this has a chance to succeed if we stick with it. No one can guarantee it, but I think it has a chance. What are the facts? Well, the facts are that in this century, whenever the gross national product of any nation has been affected by as much as 3%, that policy of that nation has been changed through sanctions. And the most prior to this time that we have had any impact on the GNP of any country through sanctions is 16%. In the case of Iraq today, so far as we know, it is approximately 50%. There is no precedent for this in this century, as far as I know, in any other country until you go back to the Middle Ages. It is powerful. 2 nights ago, I talked to the chief executive officer of one of the major corporations of this country that does hundreds of millions of dollars of business overseas, perhaps billions, and he said, doesn't anyone realize, the administration, that you are having a huge impact on the economy of Iraq and that they can't simply continue if you just hold on to sanctions? We apparently haven't recognized that with the administration, and I have to make an exception, and that is the CIA. I don't know how long Judge Webster can stay on the head of the CIA, but he has delivered a different message to Congress than has the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense. The reality is, and this is not classified information, my colleague Senator Moynihan is going to talk a little bit about why we classify certain information. But we are already raising bread, sugar, tea, and it's clamped down. So the food items have gone up 700%. They can't manufacture tires. Much of their manufacturing plant has disappeared. They can't get spare parts for their whole military complex. They can't get spare parts for city buses in Baghdad. And the sanctions have just barely begun. Question asked the other day on the floor of the Senate, Senator Dole, the minority leader, is the very basic question. Will Saddam be strengthened or weakened if we just hold on to sanctions? Senator Dole drew the conclusion that he would be strengthened. I suggest the evidence is overwhelming that he will be weakened, that the military will be weakened. If a year from now we find that sanctions don't work, and we decide on the military option, I suggest we will go against a much weakened opponent. The two immediate past chairmen of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Crow and General Jones, have both suggested we ought to stick with sanctions and not use the military option. 6 of the 7 living former secretaries of defense, serving in both Republican and Democratic administrations, have suggested we ought to stick with sanctions and not use the military option at this point. I think we are listening to them. Former Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara says in the next year, if we stick with sanctions, that Saddam's military is going to be greatly weakened. Director Judge Webster of the CIA has said the same. Do we just ignore this? I think the administration is making a great mistake in giving up on the sanctions option. And then the final option is the military option. Senator Mitchell, in his excellent statement here about an hour ago, said the great decision for war is being made prematurely. I believe he's correct. Now, militarily, we can win in terms of what's going to take place. I was over with Senator Mitchell and a few of my colleagues about 2 weeks ago to that area and at the military briefing. There is no question that we can win. How rapidly we can win is certainly an unknown. But it is too easy here or in the Oval Office in an antiseptic kind of situation to say we're going to make a decision that will cost thousands of lives and tens of thousands of lives. Not just Americans, Iraqis, and a lot of innocent people. It will not be the life of a single senator lost, not a life of a single House member. But it was interesting in a discussion the other day, our colleague, Senator Pryor, said he was in a supermarket. A woman came up to him and said, Senator Pryor, you have 3 sons. And he said, that's correct. And she asked him, would you be willing to give up one of those, the life of one of the sons, to free Kuwait? That is the question to rest on us. And it is not only that we would be willing to give up lives. Retired faculty member from Southern Illinois University, Christensen, said, are we willing to kill to free Kuwait? That's of what must rest on our conscience. The reality also is, and this is one of the things that hit me when I went over to the Middle East, is the situation is vastly more complicated than I realize. More complicated in, first of all, the appeal to grassroots Arab Muslims as Saddam has made, and we shouldn't fool ourselves that that isn't there, including in the countries where we have groups committed to helping us. I'm talking Saudi Arabia and Egypt and Syria and the other countries. But let me give you just one more complication. Iraq has missiles aimed at Tel Aviv. Iraq says, and the foreign minister reiterated it yesterday, we launch an attack in Iraq, they're going to send missiles into Tel Aviv. Israel says she will respond. And who can blame Israel for responding? But to respond, Israel has to send those missiles, those planes, over Jordan and Syria. And Jordan and Syria have said if Israel sends her missiles and planes to Jordan and Syria, they consider that an act of war, and they will attack Israel. We can, in addition to the massive loss of lives, have a first-class mess in the Middle East. And who will be sharing the casualties on our side? When Secretary McNamara testified before the Foreign Relations Committee, he said 90% of casualties would be American casualties. And I told my staff I thought it was wrong because only 2/3 of the people over there in the armed forces are Americans. But when I got over there and got the military briefings, I came away with a feeling it would be 90% at least, and perhaps higher. In the Foreign Relations Committee the other day, Senator Sarbanes pointed out that in Korea, where we have more participation from others, from the Canadians, from the Turks, from the Australians and others, 95% of the deaths outside of South Korea were American deaths. 90% of those wounded were Americans. We are 6% of the world's population. Why should we, in resisting aggression, we should resist aggression. Why should we assume more than 90% of the casualties? I don't think there is any justification for that. What if we win? Nobody seems to ask that question. What if we win? We will win. But what does this do to the United States afterwards? Number one, in the minds of a great many people in the Muslim world, not just the Arab world, the Muslim world, it is the United States versus the Muslim world. It is going to diminish our ability to be an effective diplomatic voice in much of the world, and particularly in the Middle East. The lessons of history, I suggest, and I just finished reading a book by John Eisenhower, the son of the late president, on the Mexican War. The lesson of history is that we too easily, in a manner of patriotic fervor, get in wars and cause all kinds of needless casualties. Let's learn from history. It's going to be costly. Costly in terms, I think a rough estimate is $1 billion a day if we get involved. That's money that adds to the deficit or is taken away from education and health care with great need. And finally, Mr. President, when Senator Mitchell and our small group came back from the Middle East after visiting Saudi Arabia, Caribbean, Egypt, and Israel, we met later that day with the President for more than an hour and had a good discussion, and I applaud the President for meeting us. And the President said, finally, let me give you this final message, and he particularly looked at Senator Mitchell and me as he said this. He said, let me give you this final message. If we use the military, we can make the United Nations a really meaningful, effective voice of peace and stability in the future. And I said, Mr. President, can I give you a 30-second response? If Libya leads Chad, you're not going to send 400,000 troops. What you would be willing to do, and what other nations would be willing to do, is vote sanctions. If we stick with sanctions, then we have a mechanism, the sanctions work. Then we have a mechanism that the community of nations can use again and again and again, and it's a shared burden. Yes, for example, India, where our colleague Senator Moynihan served as ambassador, is hurting. They voted for sanctions. They're hurting because of what's happening in the price of oil, but they're hurting, and so are all nations hurting, virtually all nations hurting because of this. Sanctions is a burden that is shared uniformly. I hope that this Senate, instead of rushing in a moment of fervor and passion into a decision, I hope we will look at the lessons of history. I hope we will have what President Eisenhower called the courage of patience. That's what we need today, and I hope we have the good sense to have that courage.
Well, Senator from Minnesota.
Mr. President, first of all, let me thank Senator Simon for his eloquent statement. Mr. President, please note I would like to have my name included in support of the Mitchell-Nunn resolution. This is not a speech that I want to give. I rise to speak in this chamber for the first time with a very heavy heart. I wanted my first speech to be about children and education, and health care, and renewable energy policy, environment. I never thought the first time I would have an opportunity to speak in this chamber, the topic would be such a grave topic. Life and death. Whether or not to go to war. To ask America's men and women, so many of them so young, to risk life and limb, to unleash tremendous destructive power on a foreign country and faraway people. This is the most momentous decision that any political leader ever have to make, and decide we must. And let no one doubt that the Congress has a responsibility to make this decision. The Constitution is ambiguous on this point. Congress declares war, not the President. Mr. President, I give no ground to any of my colleagues in my condemnation of Saddam Hussein. It is a bedrock principle of world order that no country has the right to go in and swap up another country. And that is why I supported the President's policy at the beginning, a policy that I think the President has abandoned. It was such a successful policy. The economic sanctions worked, rallying the international community, isolating Saddam Hussein, and most important of all, I believe official policy was well on its way to prove the point that we can respond to aggression without the slaughter that modern-day warfare brings. Mass slaughter. I mean to say just that, Mr. President. War means death and destruction. And there are some in this chamber, they believe that this truth is so obvious that it need not be said. I think it needs to be said all over again. I observed this debate. It seems to me that all too often, in the theorizing about strategy and politics, this is forgotten. What war means in human terms. The terrible loss of life, broken dreams, broke lives, broke families. I will tell you something, Mr. President. The fathers and mothers of young men and women from Minnesota who went from the Persian Gulf have not forgotten what war means in personal terms, and we must not forget either. Town meeting after town meeting after town meeting, citizens stand up, quite often Vietnam vets, point a finger at me and say, Senator, how many of the senator's children are in the Persian Gulf? How many of the senator's children are in the Persian Gulf? And I would respond this way. I would say, I'm the son of a Jewish immigrant from the Soviet Union. And if I believe Saddam Hussein and Hitler and that we must go to war to stop him, if I believe we must do that for the defense of our country, for the defense of this world, I am a citizen in this world, that as much as I could hardly stand the thought, I could accept the loss of life of one of my children, ages 25, 21, and 18. I'd rather it be me, but I could accept the loss of their life. But this is the truth. I could not accept the loss of life of any of our children in the Persian Gulf right now, and that tells me that my gut, I do not believe there's time to go to war. I do not believe the administration has made this case to go to war, and if I apply this standard to my children, then I have to apply this standard to everyone's children. I have to apply this standard to all of God's children. President Bush appears to be on the verge of making a terrible mistake that will have tragic consequences for the whole world. Life is precious. War is an option that you pursue when all other options have been tried. We have not given sanctions a chance. The policies that I am afraid the administration is pursuing, the rush to war that I am afraid is so much a part of what is now happening in our country and the world, will not create a new order, Mr. President. It will create a new world disorder. What kind of victory will it be? What kind of victory will it be if we unleash forces of fanaticism in the Middle East and a chronically unstable region becomes even more unstable, further jeopardizing Israel's security? We're the ones, as my colleagues have said so well, who pay the large part of the price with loss of life. What does it mean? What kind of victory would it be if we shoulder this responsibility, if the line fractures, and if there is an explosion of anti-American fury throughout the Arab world, accompanied by widespread violence and terrorism? What kind of victory will that be? What kind of victory will it be if our already fragile economy is fractured? Whatever happened to the war on poverty, the war against drugs, the war against illiteracy, the war to make sure that our citizens not go without adequate health care? Whatever happened to the war against poison of the air, land, water? What kind of victory would it be if we're so paralyzed economically that we cannot deal with any of these pressing domestic needs? And what kind of victory will it be if our country, a country I love dearly, is torn apart again? Torn apart again. And what kind of victory will it be if tens of thousands of people die in the Persian Gulf, so many of them, and I may state this point carefully because I mean no disrespect, so many of them disproportionately men and women of color low and moderate income. What kind of victory will this be? Some causes are worth fighting for. Some causes are worth fighting for. This cause is not worth fighting for right now. We must stay the course with economic sanctions, continue the pressure, continue the squeeze, move forward on the diplomatic front, and Mr. President, we must not rush to war. Very large and long-term interests of our country and the world are at stake in the decision that we are about to make. And our options are not simply war or appeasement. I very much resent any discussion that suggests that anybody who says, as I'm saying today, that we must not rush to war in any way, shape, or form talking about appeasement. Negotiations are not appeasement. Every diplomat knows this. Our options are not simply war or peace. And we have an opportunity to stay the course with sanctions, and we have an opportunity in the international community to show that there's a new way to respond to pressure, where conflict can be resolved without resorting to war. It is too early to give up on that approach. It is the mark of a great nation that it has the patience and the conviction to pursue its highest goals. We stand on the brink of catastrophe if we allow domestic politics, self-imposed deadlines, or military logistics to rush us into a war that no one wants, and or that even in victory will so severely damage our national interests. An agenda for war has been laid out. It's time to develop an agenda for peace. I leave you, Mr. President, with a wonderful Hebrew word, cocoon. It means to understand and to heal and to transform the world. Thank you very much.
Mr. President, Senator from New York.
President, it falls to me to have the special honor and pleasure to welcome the senator from Minnesota to not to our chambers, but to our deliberations. We have heard a voice of passion, conviction, and understanding that will be with us a very long while, and we're all very pleased to have him here.
Senator, yield for just...
I'm happy to do it.
I thank the Senator for yielding. I want to bring my distinguished from New York and compliment our new colleague from Minnesota. I've entered my second term. I guess in the 3 different elections that I've been here, I've heard a number of first speeches on the floor of the Senate. But that brief time that I've been here, have I not heard any speech eloquent, more thoughtful, and more laced through passion and insight into what confronts us now, the speech just given by the distinguished Senator from Minnesota. He has truly made a maiden speech on the floor that will serve him and his body well as he continues to represent the fine state of Minnesota. I want to compliment him for a great speech. And I thank the distinguished Senator for you.
Mr. President, I note that we are now in the afternoon. We've heard a series of able presentations that began with Majority Leader. Most recently now, the memorable maiden speech of the Senator from Minnesota. And we've often heard a word in opposition to the resolution, the joint resolution before us. And may I ask, Madam President, that my name be added to the resolution?
Without objection, it is supported.
Indeed, Mr. President, it is through the fact that there is not a single senator on the other side of the aisle. Not only have we not heard differing views, we haven't, does the Senator from New York have the power to summon the presence of Senators from Pennsylvania? I had not anticipated, but I would like to report that there is a most distinguished senator from the other side. We have heard, Mr. President, a continued theme in our debate today, or our discussion, has been what happened to a presidential policy that had the complete support and it makes no matter of this body, of the country, as late as the October. What was sudden change was brought the grave concerns that brings to the floor in special session, in effect, of the 100th Congress. And the evidence of this it could not be more clear on the 8th or thereabouts of September. Adopted by a vote 96-3, a current resolution introduced by Mr. Mitchell, or himself, Mr. Dole, and others of us, in which, taking note of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, we resolved that the goals the President set forth were our goals, and we stated, I read this second paragraph of the resolve clauses, the Congress approves the action taken by the President in support of these goals, including the involvement of the United Nations and the friendly governments. The Congress supports continued action by the President in accordance with the decisions of the Security Council, in accordance with the United States constitutional and statutory processes, including the authorization and appropriation of funds by the Congress to deter Iraqi aggression and protect American lives and vital interests in the region. 96-3. What happened? How did it come about that we are here on the Senate floor talking of war? Talking of war in a region where the massed forces on either side are larger than any such encounter since the Second World War. 1 million armed men and women on either side of a line in sand. And the prospect of hideous encounters. All of it arises in the aftermath of the invasion of one small third world country to another smaller third world country. In one of those third world countries, the indigenous population and their swamp was compounded by about 4 times that number in immigrant laborers brought in as servants. Both of them wealthy countries agreed a wealthy, a Stanford professor in 1938 discovered the Arabian oil dump, and suddenly wealth appeared, but not very important country. Senator Simon was kind enough to mention I was once ambassador to India, and that part of the world was not unconnected. It had once been governed by the British from Delhi. Well, the Emirates been called forth the official scouts from 7,000 people managed the area. Iraq as such is a artifact of the Treaty of Sav, which was 1919, or was it 1918, ended the First World War with Turkey, the Allies in Turkey. The borders of Iraq were drawn in a tent in 1925 by a British colonial officer. Nothing large about these places. Very recently, I can remember, I was also, if I may say, once our ambassador to the United Nations. I remember Kuwait at the United Nations as a particularly poisonous enemy of the United States. You can be an antagonist of the United States and do it in a way that left room for further discussions afterwards. The Kuwaitis had a singularly nasty Party. Their anti-Semitism was at the level of the personally loathsome. When Resolution 3379 passed the body, the General Assembly, the cookies were conspicuously poisonous. By contrast, the Iraqis were very recently said to be our friends by our administration. Last summer, the Committee on Foreign Relations held hearings. My colleague, Senator Otto, asked for them on the particularly outrageous behavior, as we thought, as he and he agreed, for the Iraqi government with respect to the use of poison gas, suppression of the Kurds, actions of a whole range, such that we reported, Senator Hill, the distinguished chairman of the Committee on Foreign Relations, reported the Iraq International Law Compliance Act of 1990. And it gave a list of specific violations of international law by Iraq. It said our findings were that the government of Iraq has systematically detained, tortured, and executed thousands of their own citizens. The government of Iraq has destroyed more than 3,000 villages and towns in the Kurdish regions of Iraq. Iraq has used chemical weapons on an extensive scale against its Kurdish citizens, resulting in tens of thousands of deaths. Amnesty International has documented extensive violations of human rights by the government of Iraq, including torture and murder of children as a means of punishing their parents. Iraq has blatantly violated international law in initiating use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war against citizens. Iraq has failed to ratify biological weapons, and therefore we find Iraq has engaged in a consistent pattern of gross violations of international recognized human rights and disregard for international law. We think, that being the case, we will not any longer subsidize bills of agriculture to Iraq. Well, this matter came to the fore. We learned from the other side of the aisle, a distinguished senator from Indiana, said the State Department opposes the virtually total economic embargo of Iraq, which would result from this amendment. Now, odd. This was 7 days. This was July 26th, 7 days before Iraq invaded Kuwait. If Kuwait, a particularly nasty little regime given to poisonously anti-American, anti-Semitic announcements, Internet Parliamentary Union, place like that. And here Iraq, who are subsidizing its food imports, about 2/3 of food. Just when Senator Powell tried to say, now, this is a country that is utterly outrageous, murder, mayhem, violation of human rights, violation of international law, state partners don't touch them, don't follow them. We're against the measure. Well, the measure passed. Not eventually the State Department managed to see that it did not become law past the Senate. But here these two countries, neither of them very attractive. Kuwait, openly contemptuous of and hostile to the United States. Iraq, the beneficiary of the United States. Something that is reverse, total reverse of our attitudes. And suddenly, on behalf of Kuwait, in opposition to Iraq, we see the largest array of armed force since mankind has seen since the Second World War, and we see a president asserting that he has the right to send those our forces into battle independently of any judgment of the Senate, and lawyers have told us so. Now, how could this happen? This first Cold War crisis, as we have heard described. I'd like to suggest, Mr. President, and I hope this might help us think about something. I'd like to suggest that despite the assertions that this was the first post-World War crisis, and the way in which it proceeded in that mode, and which manner obtained universal support of the country and the senator, here to make no matter. Suddenly, there was an institutional lurch back into the manner and mode of the Cold War. It has been with us so long, we don't know how to act differently. We haven't acquired the instincts, the institutions, the institutional memories to do other than not what we have been doing for so long. We know nothing else. And that is what happened on November 8th. That suddenly lurched into a Cold War. It happened, Mr. President, last November. The Committee on Foreign Relations had series of hearings on the subject after the Cold War. Our subject was the changes in American government which have taken place over the long struggle with totalitarianism as it emerged really from the First World War. As Judith Sklar has written, 1914 is, after all, when it all began. 1914 to 1989, a 75-year war, which inevitably changed attitudes, institutions. And we were looking at the attitudes that and institutions that changed and the ways they did. And I chaired the hearing, so I took the opportunity to organize our inquiry around an extraordinary speech which Woodrow Wilson gave in St. Louis, Missouri, on September 5, 1919. It was on that trip around the country, pleading for public support to influence the Senate here, which was considering the Treaty of Versailles with the League of Nations Covenant in it. Wilson was asking for that support. 20 days, Pueblo, Colorado, where he'd collapse and not be, it would be in effect the end of his presidency. And I see the senator from St. Louis is on the floor. And I think he, the senior senator, would recognize the thought that Wilson's remark had about him the quality of prophecy. At the end of his life, he would in effect, he would die in 50 days. And he was trying to tell America what he would leave behind them. He said, what would happen if we didn't establish a world order? There was law, was some procedure where peace was enforced. And if we didn't, what would come instead? He said, very well then, if we must stand apart and be the hostile rivals of the rest of the world, we must do something else. We must be physically ready for anything to come. We must have a great standing army. We must see to it that every man in America is trained to arms. We must see to it that there are munitions and guns enough for an army, and that means a mobilized nation, that they are not only laid in store, but that they're kept up to date, that they're ready to use tomorrow, that we are a nation in arms. And then, what would a nation in arms be? He said, well, you know, you've got to think of the President of the United States not as the chief counselor of the nation, elected for a little while, but as the man meant constantly and every day to be commander-in-chief of the armies and navy of the United States, ready to order in any part of the world where the threat of war is a menace to his own people. And then he said, and you can't do that under the debate. You can't do that under public counsel. Plans must be kept secret. Knowledge must be accumulated by a system which we have condemned because we call it a spying system. The more polite call it a system of intelligence. And then he went on a little further to see, in effect, how the world would shape itself up into one of continuing crisis. And so, Mr. President, in that speech of St. Louis, which is, say, had about a prophetic quality which haunts one to this day, Woodrow Wilson said we would see the emergence of a system of government in which the president had become commander-in-chief, head of armed forces. What happened? And nothing is more extraordinary evidence of it having happened. The assertions we have heard in the past month and working from a defensive, deterrent position, which we respond to very well, to an offensive position on the matter, a measure taken in secret, and that suddenly turned what had been a collective security operation with the complete support of the country and the world into a crisis situation. All three of those things, the president, commander-in-chief, secretly moving to create the ongoing permanent Orwellian crisis. And that was entirely in his own hands. I mean, the president told a press conference on November 30 when asked, do you think what do you think your responsibilities are to Congress and the people that elect them? He said, consultation. But when asked on December 28th by Dave Frost, don't you need an authorization from Congress in effect for war? He said, we've used military force 200 times in history. I think there have been 5 declarations of war. In effect, he doesn't need congressional support to do what really the Constitution requires him. This is an idea that simply eroded in the Cold War. And the prospect of nuclear confrontation, admitting no time for reflection, no time for consultation, immediate response. The New York Times this morning, very easy, I think, Congress's constitutional making authority fell into disuse during the Cold War, so much that we can scarcely remember the number of times we've declared war. Some in the House, the notion we declared war once during World War II. We declared war 3 times, different countries in one form or another. But in the aftermath, what we find here is a kind of time war in which we're acting in old mode with response to a new condition. I find it, for example, extraordinary that the president should so personalize the encounter with this particular thought in Baghdad, most recent thought in Baghdad, not the last by any means. They'll be on there to speak of it. It is that mode of which we are in a bimodal, permanent, practice encounter with the enemy. That you agree, totalitarian, Leninist, communism, without any moment, pause almost, we shifted to the enemy of this, the person of the head of this significant small country. Boundaries were drawn in 1925 to intent by an English colonial servant, an artifact of the of Lohan. I said without a pause, I should come back and say no, there was an intent. Among other things that got lost in the Cold War, along with the rational responsibilities with regard to our conflict, the idea of international law got lost in the fog of the Cold War as well. When we came to the floor here 7 days before the invasion of Kuwait by Iraq, with the Iraq National Compliance Act of 1990, State Department Act, State Department, no concern that we could list a series of solemn treaties, obligations which had been violated by a country we were supporting. I mean, well, all we were asking was to stop subsidizing exports to them. Then came invasion. Then came one of the most extraordinary aversion to an earlier model I think any of us have seen in the presidency. International law as an idea had almost disappeared from the vocabulary of American presidents. Suddenly, with the invasion of Kuwait, the summoning of the State Council, it appears every other sentence. A president gave a press conference at the end of August in which he used the term international law 6 times in 15 minutes. That about equals the total record of the previous 30 years, or like that memory serves. We did see the charter system put into place in a manner hopeful as no other since the establishment of the United Nations in 1945. Chapter 7 has a very clearly gradated series of responses to aggression. We went to the Security Council for the first time in history of United Nations. All permanent members agreed that a quite egregious act of aggression had happened. One of the qualities of aggression, Mr. President, is that in its post-war quality is that an army crossed the border, absorbed another country. The characteristic conflict of the Cold War was one side or the other would mount internal opposition to a given regime. And you'd have civil war, you'd have proxy war, but no actual armies crossing borders, such that some people suggest that perhaps that era was over. Well, while there was an international ideological struggle between the free world and the communist world, it took the form of subversion, like certainly for a period where the Marxists had forces, sometimes military forces, sometimes political forces, in a major country in the world. And trying to activate them was their technique rather than sort of rolling into a country. And when they finally got in Afghanistan, it was the end of their expansion. In any event, at the end of the Cold War, you didn't quite indeed see almost immediately the reappearance of an old mode of aggression, which was army crossing borders and absorbing people. Well, the UN was trying to deal with that. That's how the Second World War started. The Soviet and the Nazi forces crossed the Polish border and annihilated that country. Armies crossed the border. Well, here was the case, and the response was admirable. We prayed a little bit here and there for it, but we got it. And the response of the embargo, first instance, there's never been an opportunity for economic sanctions of this kind to work equal to the Iraqi situation where they have one export product not in short supply in the world, and import about 2/3 of their food, import their currency, Mr. President. Syria, that's a dinar. It's a handsome piece of currency. It's printed in London. The Iraqis do not have technology to print their own paper money. The dollar bill, which is a high-quality paper currency, will last about 18 months. Expect this to last as about that much as long. Pretty soon there won't be any paper currency left in Iraq. Just start there. Or alternately, print up a lot and drop some airplanes and so it's chaos that. I mean, the options are infinite with respect to as isolated as this. Why couldn't we just stay with that policy? I suggested it was because it was too new, even though it was policy we had put in place in the sense that the United Nations Charter is largely an American document. The idea of collective security is certainly an American idea, not exclusively that. And the institution, for nothing, has its headquarters in New York City. We were following that mold and suddenly lurched out. Suddenly, from a situation where the world was defending a small country that had been attacked by a larger neighbor, suddenly the United States had engaged the central figure of Islam in a countdown to Armageddon. Mr. President, that is a kind of madness, a kind of living in an early world, acting in ways that are of no relevance to the situation in the moment. We are not in an international crisis in the sense that events took place on August 2nd necessitate the confrontation of the largest set of armed forces since World War II. Nothing like happened. A nasty little country invaded a littler, just as nasty country. They have their virtues, I don't doubt. They've not been much on display internationally in either case. And the United States shares with the other nations of the world an interest in the resolution of the crisis of the conflict, principally the establishment of the fact that Charter is an international standard that will be enforced. The world won't be particularly different after Iraq leaves Kuwait, which it will be. Won't be any better. Will be better to the extent only that the established charter that the international community will enforce the charter. In the aftermath of the Cold War, that has become a possible. And so this is all we are saying on this side of the aisle, and I hope we will hear from the other side. Why can't continue the President's policy of August, September, and October? That was a policy appropriate to a small disturbance in a distant part of the world, where there are interests involved because that part of the world exports to sends oil to Japan, sends oil to Europe. There's interest involved because there is an international interest in the maintenance of the standards of the Charter. Fine. Not World War III. Is it not clear, Mr. President, that we didn't have World War III? It didn't happen. Some of our institutions are acting, oh my God, we missed World War III. Maybe we could have now, here, not there, but here. That borders on the edge of the disturbed. Dr. Strange, where are you now that we need you? This is so unnecessary. And with what unanimity in this body, the President would be supported if simply dropped the defensive positions of the period up to November 8, when without any announcement, a secretly planned escalation to offensive modes of he said, time, the good time in the world. Because, Mr. President, our armies have been on the Rhine for 45 years. And that's the stuff of Roman legions. I mean, we're still in Pastor John. We would have had a naval force with some land facilities, a base in the Gulf on the Second World War. Well, 12 months will pass, 18 months will pass, life will go on, and we will not have the wrenching constitutional crisis that will come about from the President committing a massive use of our armed forces in a distant region of the world without the specific declaration of war by Congress. If I conclude, Mr. President, simply please the President, he will have that constitutional crisis. Regardless of the outcome of the conflict, the primacy of the Constitution will have been denied just at that moment when it was seemed possible to return to what was once the normal conduct of foreign affairs by the President and the Congress of the United States. Mr. President, I thank you for your courtesy, and I move the floor.
Mr. President.
The senator from Pennsylvania, I believe, was here first. All four were on your feet at the same time, calling at the same time, and I do my best to hear which one did first. I therefore recognize the senator from Pennsylvania.
Well, I thank the chair. I have been here since 10 o'clock this morning and had awaited some of the speeches in support of the resolution until the distinguished from New York noted the absence of any arguments contrary and the absence of the Republican senator had stepped into the cloakroom for went for a bite of chicken and rushed right back out.
Mr. President, I wonder if the Senator would yield to the Senator of Virginia just for about 2.5 minutes to make what I think is an important statement directing the attention of senators to the availability of the document.
Well, I would, Mr. President, for that limited period of time, with unanimous consent, that not lose my right to the floor.
Is there objection? Hearing no objection, it's so ordered.
Mr. President, I thank my distinguished colleague. Mr. President, the Director of, and I repeat, Director of Central Intelligence, Mr. Webster, has forwarded a letter to the Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, which gives his most current views with respect to the issue of sanctions. The distinguished Majority Leader, as well as two other senators today, have stressed the importance of the economic embargo, i.e. sanctions, as they relate to the decision process that led to, presumably, this document, which is their proposed, that is, proposed joint resolution offered to the majority party. I think all senators should avail themselves as possible a copy of this letter, which should make available here in the chamber. But also the leadership of the Senate should consider making available to senators the same briefing that was given to members of the Intelligence Committee, of which I'm a member, and others, the distinguished senators here on the floor with me from Missouri and Pennsylvania. We were there yesterday. I think that brief, together with an examination of this document, would help greatly to explain the current status of our senior intelligence advisor to the President with respect to sanctions. Bottom line, he states, is the ability of the Iraq ground forces to defend Kuwait and southern Iraq is likely to be substantially eroded for the next 6 to 12 months, even if effective sanctions can be maintained. This is especially true if Iraq does not believe a coalition attack is likely during this period. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that my remarks be expanded at this point in the record, and I thank my colleague from Pennsylvania for allowing
Without objection, the remarks for being put to the record. Senator from Pennsylvania has the floor.
I would allow a comment for 30 seconds by my colleague from New York. Again, there is unanimous consent that I do not lose my right.
Is there objection? Hearing no objection.
Mr. President, the distinguished senator of Virginia has just told us, set an example exactly what I thought about. Secrecy system. You knew what we know. You understand why we're doing what we're doing, but we can't tell you because it's secret. The briefing is secret. I was at that briefing, and I won't disclose what I learned about the price of oil in Baghdad. Secret. Mr. President, that is a cold war mode. We've lurched into it. We don't even recognize it. It's so normal to us, we didn't see it as different. Thank you.
Would the senator yield for unanimous
Has
consent?
the floor. Senator
If the senator would yield for unanimous consent without losing right to the floor.
Is there an objection? Here's no objection. Senator from Maryland asks unanimous consent.
Mr. President, there's always the danger that as you get close to the concert, everyone starts singing from the same song sheet. I would like to ask unanimous consent to include in the record immediately after the insertion of the senator from Virginia the testimony which the director of the Central Intelligence Agency gave in public session on the 5th of December. I know that predates the senator's assertion, but I think it would be helpful for the benefit of contrast. This is Director Webster's statement before committee on the House side with respect to he leads it off, address the committee on what the intelligence community believes the sanctions have already accomplished and what we believe the sanctions are likely to accomplish over time. And I ask unanimous consent that this statement of the director, given an open session before the committee went into closed session for purposes of questioning. So this was open testimony reported in the press and carried on media and generally available to the public, being included in the record immediately after the insertion of the senator.
Is there objection? Without objection, it is ordered. It will be included in the record immediately following that of the senator from Virginia, and the senator from Pennsylvania has the
My
floor.
colleague from Missouri has a request which I would yield for again on the standing.
Is there objection to the yielding? Without objection, it's so ordered. The senator from Missouri.
Mr. President, it's my understanding there has been no effort to try to sequence speakers, and my assumption is that surely 100 senators will want to speak sometime during the next few days, and it's simply a battle for the floor. If you happen to eat a chicken sandwich, as Senator Speck pointed out, you might lose the possibility to speak for 4 or 5 hours. Mr. President, I am obviously, far be it from me to try to suggest how the floor should be managed, but I will suggest that. It would be my suggestion that managers of this matter maintain a list, and that the order of speech be alternated between the majority and the minority.
The chair will state to the senator from Missouri that there is presently no matter pending on the floor that has managers. Therefore, the chair is in the position of following the basic Senate rule of recognizing the first senator who seeks recognition, not by standing but by demanding recognition. And therefore, neither the chair nor any manager at this moment, since there's a unanimous consent request, has the power to do anything other than recognize those who stand. And the senator is correct. It may be that he would have to wait some period of time or remain. I know that I will have a problem, but I'll try to overcome that of a number standing at the same time. I just happen to feel that the senator from Pennsylvania had spoken up first, and I knew he'd been here a long time. So there's no effort to try to control, keep a list, or in any way alter the rules of the Senate. And I hope the senator will consult with the leadership on both sides, and I'm hopeful we'll have a unanimous consent request and we'll have a more orderly managed system, but I'm not capable of producing at this moment. I hope the senator understands.
Well, Mr. President, I would ask you to must consent that the speakers then be alternated by party.
President, I object. That should be done in consultation with the leadership to make a decision on it.
Object.
I appreciate the senator thinking that's the best way to proceed, and in fact, the best way to proceed. But I think that setting up that procedure ought to come after more consultation.
Objection is heard. And the senator from Pennsylvania is the floor. Senator from
Senator
Pennsylvania.
yield for 10 seconds.
Again, without leaving.
Is there objection? If there's no objection, it is so ordered. The senator from Delaware.
Mr. President, I just make to my friend from Missouri. Thus far, the work's been done. There's been no alternating because there's only been one Republican seeking to speak, number one. And number two, each of us come in and said to the other, "Are you next?" is operating by comedy. I don't think there's any senator who's been called on who has called on before someone who's been here further. And I would say publicly, I was here before you and the others. I hope I get next, and I hope they do after that. But just make that point.
The senator from Pennsylvania has the floor.
I thank you, sir. Mr. President, while there is no specific resolution pending, this debate started today after the distinguished majority leader filed at the day before printing a joint resolution which is yet incomplete, but the body is present except for a section on so-called expedited proceedings. And it is the joint resolution which laid down by the distinguished majority leader which has provided the bulk of the frame of the issue today. And I would like to address myself primarily to the position set forth by the distinguished majority leader and by others in support of the joint resolution. There has been an effort, Mr. President, to portray this joint resolution as having large areas of agreement, what President Bush asked for, and only narrow areas of disagreement. And I would submit that there is an enormous difference between the actual resolution and what President Bush has asked for. The distinguished majority leader said there's no disagreement on goals, there's no disagreement that Iraq must leave. The senior senator from Georgia, Senator Nunn, said there's only one question, that's how we go about it. But the fact of the matter is that the crux of the discussion is whether the President will be authorized to use force pursuant to the United Nations Resolution 678, or whether the Congress will deny him that authority. And when you have had the United Nations Security Council with all divergent points of view, not only the French, but the Soviets and the Chinese and the others who are on the Security Council having come to agreement, and we know when you have agreements and make any change, how it all unravels, especially when the core part of that agreement is authorization to use force. So I think the first that has to be recognized emphatically is that there is an enormous difference between what Senator Mitchell's resolution proposes and what President Bush has asked for. The distinguished majority leader made quite a point on a contention that there's no evidence that sanctions are not working. And he said in the substance speech that there had been, and I quote him as closely as I can, having written down what said, no explanation of the shift from sanctions to war. But then a little later in Senator Mitchell's speech, he said, and again I come as closely as I could write it down, that administration officials have said that sanctions are not working. At a later point, he quoted the briefing of the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense Cheney, which occurred last Thursday afternoon for more than 2 hours, which this senator attended in its entirety, where Senator Mitchell made the representation that there's been no contention that sanctions have failed, only that the administration cannot guarantee that sanctions will work. I respectfully disagree with what the distinguished majority leader has characterized as the conclusions, representations of Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense. I submit a fair reading of the statement and briefing of the Senate was that the sanctions are not working. We just had the introduction letter from
Senator, you on that point?
No, I'm not, but I'd be glad to come up with you at the conclusion of my statement. I've quoted, I think, enough.
I'll understand. I'll certainly wait for the conclusion of the senator's statement, but I must...
Well, I ask Mr. President if he would say, I'd like to continue my presentation, and I'm glad to yield when I finish my statement.
The senator from Pennsylvania has the floor.
As I was saying, Mr. President, retain the chain of thought. I think this is a very, very important point. There is a conclusion by the administration that sanctions are not working. Now, there may be disagreement on that, but I think it ought to be recognized that that's the position of the President and that's the position of the administration. I would offer one comment on information which has been brought to me just recently by one of the hostages held in Kuwait, a man named Christopher Folsom, Charlestown, Pennsylvania, who was in Kuwait on August the 2nd, and who later was taken to Iraq on September 23rd. And Mr. Folsom has been in Iraq and has seen some of the stores there, and having some first knowledge, makes a very forced representation that the sanctions are not working. And I would further call the attention of the Senate to a representation made by a group of former American hostages from 30 in number. They make a number of points, but I shall limit my presentation to simply one, and that is that sanctions are having a little impact on Iraq. And I ask unanimous consent, Mr. President, that this single sheet, both sides, be included in the record at the conclusion of my statement.
Without objection, it is so ordered.
Mr. President, the third issue that I would address with respect to the Mitchell resolution is that I believe it is late in the day, frankly, too late in the day, for the Congress meaningfully to disagree with the President's request and the content of Resolution 78. Frankly, had I had my preference, I would not have opted for January 5th date. And I would have given sanctions more of an opportunity to work. But I believe as a matter of U.S. policy, we are well beyond that alternative. And in fact, as a matter of international policy, embodied in the United Nations resolution, we are well beyond that point. The United Nations resolution was enacted, Mr. President, on November 29th of 1990. And the members of the Senate and the House had ample notice of what was being accomplished with United States leadership on establishing the January 15th date and the authorization to use force. And the Congress of the United States has taken no action. It is only today, 5 days before January 15th, that the Congress is finally beginning and has not yet addressed a resolution. And, Mr. President, even a week ago today, when the new President was sworn in, there was no assurance that the Senate or House would address this issue in advance of January the 15th. Mr. President, I went to the Majority Leader last month and made the point that I thought the Senate and the House should be assembled to vote on authorization for use of force or not. I would ask unanimous consent, again, at the conclusion of my remarks, that a copy of that letter here in the record. But we know that when the distinguished senator from Iowa, Senator Harkins, and the presiding officer, the distinguished senator from Washington, Senator Adams, pressed to have a date for the Senate election a week ago today, and that was not forthcoming. And now, at the very last moment, in a very complex process, there's a resolution which is being offered which eliminates the thrust of the United Nations Resolution 678. And it is my judgment, Mr. President, that if the Congress of the United States does not back the President, and the Congress of the United States does not back Resolution 678, then our leadership in the coalition will fail completely, sanctions will disintegrate, and the coalition will disintegrate. And that we are much past the point of changing United States or United Nations policy in this important respect. And I say that, Mr. President, because even as we speak, there is no assurance that the Senate will vote on any resolution before January 15th. There has not even been the scheduling of this matter in a timely way so that if the Senate is faced with filibuster, the cloture could be filed, if that was the will of the Senate, to have a vote in advance of January 15th. So it seems to this senator that we are very, very late in the day to be stepping forward and articulating the fundamental disagreement with the United Nations solution and with what the President has requested. When the distinguished majority leader made his final point, Mr. President, and it is a very tough point, and it is a very difficult point to deal with, when he said that if we do not employ sanctions, we will be faced with the question of did soldiers, sailors, young men and women die necessarily if we do not follow through on the sanctions. And Mr. President, there's been a direct answer to that issue by the administration, by President Bush, who has said that he believes that if we do not act now, that more will die. But it is a judgment call. And it is my view, Mr. President, again repeating that my preference would have been to the contrary in a number of important respects, that if we do not follow through at this stage, if Iraq does not withdraw voluntarily from Kuwait, and if the United Nations resolution does not proceed, that we will be building a more powerful Iraq, and that we will be fighting this war in another day and a more destructive way with greater loss of life. American lives, lives of our allies in the coalition, lives on all sides. And that is a matter of judgment. So when you have the contention about not knowing whether some will die unnecessarily, there's a very strong reason to the contrary to minimize the loss of life. And that, Mr. President, brings me to what I consider to be a core of this agreement as to what is the best way to avoid war at this time. And I personally remain hopeful, Mr. President, that war will be avoided. But it seems to me that the best way to avoid a war is to put Iraq squarely on notice with a very strong support by the Congress of the UN resolution and the President that we mean business and we're prepared to fight. We wonder about the state of mind of Saddam Hussein. We wonder if he's a madman, Mr. President. I submit that he is not. Senator Shelby and I had an opportunity to visit an hour and 20 minutes President Saddam Hussein just about a year ago today. And I found him very poorly informed about U.S. policy, very poorly informed about Western attitudes, did not have an understanding of our attitude about the problems of the Middle East. He was certainly far from a madman. And there was later another Senate delegation with Senator Dole, Senator Metzenbaum, Senator McCoy, Senator Murkowski, Senator Simpson, and those senators also had a discussion with President Saddam Hussein and concluded that he's not a madman. And we wonder, what is his calculation? It seems to me that if the current course is followed and force is used, that President Saddam Hussein will lose his country. But he must have some other calculation. He may have a calculation of involving Israel in a war. He may have a calculation of trying to bring the coalition into disintegration so the Arabs will fight the Israelis. Or what he really may have in mind, and it's obviously speculative, try to think about what is President Saddam Hussein's state of mind. He may have in mind the state of mind of the United States Congress. And that is a more perplexing state of mind than the mind of Saddam Hussein. The comments have been made. I think it was the distinguished majority leader who raised a question about what was the will of Congress, doubt about the will of the Senate, always doubt about what we are undertaking. But if we unequivocally put Iraq and its president on notice of our intentions by a very solid vote, it is my judgment that we will have an excellent chance to avoid that. Mr. President, as we have looked over the activities of the United States and as we have seen the debate which has been undertaken, it is obviously a matter subject to great understanding of Iraq, President Saddam Hussein, about what our priorities are. And I believe that the value of our democratic system and our open debate is worth every bit of cost and more. And if Iraq and its leaders do not understand this, then that's regrettable, because our processes are intricate and involved, but our open debate and our open consideration of these issues is worth all the cost. And it may be that in the approach of the Congress, and we have seen in the 10 years I've been here, chaos, disagreement, uncertainty, voluminous numbers of amendments, but somehow we come together and have a resolution in a, if not a timely way, at least a way where the job gets done. And we have an opportunity, Mr. President, it seems to me, to come to a conclusion by Saturday, as the majority leader has articulated a wish or a proposed schedule if we conclude our debate, so that we can put Iraq, President Saddam Hussein, squarely on notice that there is unity. This is, Mr. President, I think the most important vote or series of votes anybody in the House or Senate will ever be called upon to make. And it is really hard to focus on the fact that in a so-called civilized 20th century society, the world is now on the brink of a calculated, premeditated, thought-out war. Seems inaccurate to say that there could be any such thing as a thought-out war, because the inconsistency on its face to equate drinking with killing in a war. That is what the world faces at this moment. We have a countdown to war, which is unprecedented in human history. We have seen such countdowns in James Bond movies and other fictional accounts, where we know that the hero will pull the fuse, perhaps with only a second remaining to avoid the catastrophe. And we are looking at that situation at the present time. We had our Secretary of State eyeball to eyeball yesterday in Geneva with Foreign Minister Aziz of Iraq. One distinguished senator from New York, Mr. Moynihan, says there is no international crisis. I have to disagree with him very strongly. You have international organizations banding together with collective force, authorizing military action. We have a foreign minister of a major power refusing even to accept a letter from the President of the United States so that his president can read the letter. We have the most speedy answer to the question asked of Minister Tariq Nassim yesterday when he was asked whether Iraq would attack Israel, and he said yes, absolutely yes. That is the height of an international crisis, Mr. President, as I see it. And we have a unique opportunity at this time in history where for decades and really centuries there has been discussion of collective security so that the peaceful nations of the world would band together, stop would-be aggressors. And for the first time in history, we have an international organization, the United Nations, which has come forward with such a proposal for collective action. There has been a discussion today about the inadequacy of the burden sharing by other countries. That point was made by the distinguished majority leader. And I agree with him that the burden sharing has not been adequate. And it seems, Mr. President, that the United States has been called on in the last 46 years, in the last 50 years really, and perhaps more than that, do more than our share. And we think the alternative, Mr. President, that either we do it or it doesn't get done. And we made a calculation to do it because it's so important that it is accomplished. And there have been some difficult votes in Congress in the course of the last 10 years where we have appropriated tremendous sum of money for national defense. But the time when the emergency arose, the United States was able to project power to the Mideast in a historic fashion. And we are the primary mover. But, Mr. President, it's not accurate. The coalition and others have done nothing. I want to take the time now, Mr. President, to put the details before the Senate. I would ask unanimous consent that these documents be included in the record at the conclusion of my remarks.
Without facility.
These documents show, Mr. President, that there are some 52 nations which have made contributions to the coalition forces, and that while the United States has the largest body, in excess or between 400,000, that as of December 12th, there were more than 200,000 troops from other nations. And there have been financial contributions. Again, Mr. President, not nearly enough. This is a unique coalition where other nations have done something. Again, I say not enough, but they have done something. When the distinguished senator from Illinois, Senator Simon, said in his presentation, a year from now, we find that sanctions don't work, and we'll have a much weaker opponent. But, Mr. President, what will we have a year from now in terms of a coalition? And what will we have, Mr. President, in terms of our own strength? My assessment is that we can pretty much maintain our strength, even if we were to wait a substantial period of time. But there is no assurance that the coalition will be relatively stronger in Iraq if a year is to pass. But the critical point, Mr. President, in conclusion, is that if the Congress of the United States does not back the American president, as the United Nations and the Security Council have, then our leadership will disintegrate, and I believe there is every expectation that sanctions which require international cooperation will collapse because of the lack of confidence in the United States, which is fully warranted if there is this fundamental disagreement between the President and the Congress, and the coalition will collapse. So that we face a very difficult judgment. It is the heaviest of responsibilities for a member of this body, any member of the Congress, to vote for the use of armed forces, where we have more than 1 million people involved, more than 600,000 on our side, almost that many on the other side, and we know that the attendant deaths and attendant casualties. It is a very, very heavy responsibility. But again, Mr. President, although my preference would have been to have done things a little differently, given the economic sanctions more time to work, not to have had a deadline, right now we face that deadline in 5 days. And by far, the preferable course of action is to support the President, back the United Nations solution.
Indicated earlier.
Yes, I would.
Mr. President, I was prompted to ask the Senator to yield by a recollection he had of a closed briefing involving members of the Senate, Secretary of State, and the Secretary of Defense, which led him to question a statement made by the majority leaders addressed earlier to us in this body. The majority leader said, and I quote him, in response to my direct question just a few days ago, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense acknowledged that sanctions had not failed. I said to the Senator, I was at that meeting. I was literally only a few feet from the secretaries and the majority leaders. And so we're both there, and it is my distinct recollection that the majority leader put the question to the secretaries, whether they were saying the sanctions had failed, and they indicated that that's not what they were saying, that they were not saying that. They indicated that they could not guarantee that the sanctions would work. That's a different question. The majority leader, in fact, has gone on and made the point that that's what they indicated. So I only rise to take issue with the questioning of the senator of the majority leader's statements to the nature of that meeting and the questions and answers were put.
Well, by way of reply, my statement is that a fair reading of the Secretary of State Baker and Secretary of Defense Cheney had to say was that the sanctions were failing, and that it was because that was not a course which was calculated to produce results that they were not going to produce that course.
The majority leader
if the sanctions were working, of course this is tied into coalition which has to support the sanctions and retention of the coalition, and I think there would have been a different conclusion by the President and his administration.
Do you question the accuracy of the majority leader's report of that question and answer section?
I do. I believe that a fair reading of what Secretary of State Baker and Secretary of Defense Cheney said was that the sanctions were not working.
No, the question that was put, and which the majority leader reported, was whether sanctions had failed. He asked them whether they were saying that sanctions had failed, and they said, no, they were not saying that. But they went on to say that they could guarantee that the sanctions would work. And that's exactly what the majority leader said in his statement. And I was at that meeting. Now, you may want to differ with the substance of the conclusion, but I don't think you should take the floor and cast a doubt over a factual report of the question and answer section.
Well,
and I, at least as one senator, if that's what you intend to do, have taken the floor to make the point that I have a very definite and distinct recollection, contrary to the one that the senator from Pennsylvania has asserted here on the floor of the Senate.
Well, I was present myself. And when you say the senator should not take the floor and disagree with what the majority leader has said, how does that apply to the senator from Maryland taking the floor and agreeing with what the senator from Pennsylvania has said? I believe that any of us is privileged to take the floor, to express our views as to what we believe are facts, as well as what we believe are contention. And my statement was that Secretary Baker, Secretary Cheney said that the sanctions were not working. It was a fair reading of what they were saying. The senator from Maryland,
you also said,
I have the floor. And the senator from Maryland then rises and says, no, they said that the sanctions are not failing. But when you change the wording, the sanctions are not failing. My statement, which is a fair reading of their representation that the sanctions were not working, that's what I think they said. I think it is bolstered by the fact that they have abandoned the sanctions. Jim Baker and Dick Cheney and George Bush don't go to war any more than you and I do. And they have chosen the course to use force or have an option because the sanctions are not working. That's their conclusion. And the Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense there for 2.25 hours. And I was there from the minute it started until the minute it ended. And I repeat, a fair reading of what they said was the sanctions were not working.
Mr. President, I
Senator from Pennsylvania, the floor. Who seeks recognition? Mr. President. Senator from Delaware and standing for
Senator, for 30 seconds.
Senator from Delaware is recognized.
30 seconds out, this right to the floor.
President, I'll simply close it on this. The senator from Pennsylvania, as I understood him, and I listened carefully earlier when he spoke, cast doubt on the majority leader's assertion that in that closed briefing, when he put a question to the two secretaries as to whether they were saying that the sanctions had failed, and that they said, in response, I'm now quoting the majority leader, in response to my direct question, just a few days ago, both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense acknowledged sanctions had not failed. That was a direct question put to them. That was their response.
Mr. President.
Senator from Delaware.
I have the floor. You'll have 30 seconds. I'm all right to lose without losing the floor. You like 30 seconds?
I don't know who's got the floor. Senator, yield just for 30
I ask
seconds.
an asking senator can yield for 30 seconds without losing my right to the floor.
Objection. I thought the senator from Pennsylvania started before I apologize. No, the senator from Delaware is recognized.
Yes.
Yes. I understand. I would just think I was hoping that we could get into these kinds of colloquies on the floor. I know senators want to give their speeches and express their views on the issue, but I would hope that we would have time to be able to engage in these kinds of colloquies on the Senate floor to ferret out information that may be false or inaccurate or whatever it was, correct the record, that sort of thing. And so I just respond to a couple of things that the distinguished senator from Pennsylvania said, whom I have the greatest respect, is one of the
President, parliamentary inquiry. Who has the floor?
The federal state is parliamentary.
Who has the floor?
The senator from Delaware has the floor.
Mr. President, I object to the senator from Iowa making speeches on the senator from Delaware.
An unanimous consent request was made. With objection, it was agreed to.
Time is up.
Mr. President, what was the request?
I think it's
It was consent request. The senator from Iowa will be recognized in 30 seconds.
How much of that time
30
remains?
seconds has expired. Senator from Delaware is recognized.
Mr. President, before I begin my speech, I would like to say I understand the senator from Iowa's concern engaging in a debate, but I know the senator from Pennsylvania extremely well. I think we have, as they said in one of those old James Bond movies, what we have is we have a lack of communication. What the majority leader said in the meeting was precisely accurate. But what the senator from Pennsylvania, as I heard him, is saying, a reasonable person could sit here and say, the flip side of that is this is not working. I have not failed to do what's said in a private meeting has been said publicly. It's said before our committee. When the Secretary of State was asked, Foreign Relations Committee, have they failed? No, they have not failed, but they will not produce the result they hope to achieve. That a reasonable person could sit there and say, well, that means they're not working. But I don't want, that's the reason I'm not yielding to that kind of debate at this point, having waited here as long as I have to make what I hope is my contribution to this debate in first of two speeches I will attempt to make on the floor, one today and one tomorrow. Mr. President, this whole debate, in my view, at this point could have been avoided. Not the debate about whether or not sanctions have failed or not failed, but the debate about whether or not to give the President authority to unleash the awesome military power and capability of the United States, much of which is sitting in the Persian Gulf. I believe it could have been avoided, but it just doesn't make much sense to go back and debate other than after the fact, when this is all over, we should go back and debate how and why I think it could have been avoided. I hope that it can be instructive in the future. I thought the senator from New York said best when we seem not to have learned any of the lessons from the Cold War victory that we achieved without ever having to have that third World War that everyone on the center right was suggesting was inevitable in order to be able to have our principles succeed. And I think that's part of our problem here. The fact of the matter is that the mistake we're about to make, if grant the President the authority to commit those forces to battle, can also be avoided. It is not too late. A number of senators have written today on the floor and said that although they would have liked sanctions to continue to work, the defensive posture protecting the rest of all, plus sanctions strangling a literal siege in the Middle Age events on the country of Iraq of 17 million people, notwithstanding the fact they thought that that was working pretty well and they'd like it to work, they would have, if they had brothers continue the policy. We're beyond that, they say. And they're beyond that, say, because we've already made a judgment. The President made a serious mistake. We all make mistakes. Lord knows I've made a number of them, but never have had the responsibility that when a mistake is made, it could be a consequence of this unless it is turned around. The mistake that was made was the President decided that he could achieve the objective sought by all of us, getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait by a show of overwhelming force, offensive force. The President changed his vocabulary on November the 8th. He started using the word offensive instead of defensive. And it was an honest, accurate change in his vocabulary. Because he said, now we're going to commit over 400,000 troops, this was in November, over the next several months to the Persian Gulf. Now, he put himself in a position, I believe, because I don't believe he wants war, of assuming that if we had a show of overwhelming force Saddam Hussein would see the wisdom of withdrawing prior to being militarily crushed by this overwhelming force. Nations can't bluff. That is high-stakes poker. He made that judgment. And when he made the judgment, the very day he made that judgment, I went on record on some of the national TV shows in my home state and said, look, this is a serious mistake, and mark my words, what we're going to hear. We're going to hear from this moment on that anyone who disagrees with the policy of the president from this moment on is either abandoning our young men and women in the field, showing a lack of unity which will embolden Saddam Hussein, giving comfort to the enemy. What? The senator and the chair and I are both of that so-called Vietnam generation. Every time we'd raise our voice in opposition, we were told, you're giving aid and comfort to Ho Chi Minh. Maybe, in a sense, we were. In that wasn't total unity. And to the extent there's unity, the opposition thinks if we just hold out longer. But the corollary to that is, what my friends who make that argument has been made on the floor this morning. It's been made in the Judiciary Committee in the hearings I had yesterday, made in the Foreign Relations Committee by our colleagues. The flip side of that is this. If a president embarks on a foolish policy against long-term interests of the United States, it is better to sign on to that foolish policy and show unity, thereby increasing incrementally the prospects that the threat, as foolish as it may be, may produce the result desired, than it is to say, whoa, slow up here. There's an acquaintance of mine, a former CEO of a company in my state, who in a briefing one day used the phrase that I suspect is used before, although I'd never heard it before. He said, we have a policy in this outfit. He said, when you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. When you find yourself in a hole, stop digging. Now we're in a bit of a hole here. The arguments made by those who want to give the president the authority to use force will have beyond the foreign policy sound or lack of the argument, will also have a strong political, international sense into it. That's accurate. They'll be able to say, as you'll hear time and again, and if God forbid that we go this route, we'll hear God knows how long. They'll be able to say, you're showing disunity. You're weakening our position. You'll hear it 6 months from now, if God forbid we're at war and start war at that time. Those who continue to argue against policy back in the United States Senate are giving that Iraqi foxhole that little bit more heart to stay. Hold on just a bit more, and so on, and so on, and so on. But you know what? It's a little like if we said to the jewel thief, just came out of the ground floor of the building, and said, look, if you don't give back those jewels, I'm going to jump on top and kill you from the 7th floor. That may be enough to make him give them back. I'll tell you what, if he doesn't, you have just caused yourself more pain and injury than anything that possibly flow from in keeping the jewels. But that's not the choice here. Saddam Hussein doesn't have to keep the jewels, or we go to war. That should not be the debate. That's not really what's at issue. But the fact of the matter is, President, that's how it will be characterized. you know, by the international organization. They're in full support of this. Of course they're in full support of it. We have a new world order. The United Nations has voted, and if they continue this world order, will continue to vote to allow the United States of America to write any song in the world. It's classified, we can't say it, so I will whisper down the lane like everybody else does here. It is fair to say what has been stated publicly, that our experts in this administration are not counting on everybody to participate who signed on now, to say the least. If there's a war, 95% of the casualties on the world side will be American. If there's a war, we will prevail. We will win the battle. But 95% of the community of the Arab world outside of Iraq, to the extent there is any, will be directed at the United States. They're already trying to cut their own deal, notwithstanding the fact that they say they'll go to war. I hear, well, coalition can't hold in peace. Gentlemen and ladies of the Senate, I ask you, if this outfit can't hold together in time of peace, coalition, what are your bets about holding together in time of war? I'm willing to make book on that one. So every argument can be made as to why we must move now to war because the peaceful coalition will break down is accurate in spades. If we go to war, we win. And we inherit the win. Saddam Hussein's out of Kuwait. That's the administration officials. What's the next step? Well, Secretary of Defense at the House was close enough to say, what contingency plans to Nebraska? And he said, we have one. Why don't we think the next logical step may be? You put your right foot in front of your left, and unless you're going to stay still, the left is going to have to follow. Left foot is going to land a vacuum, Mr. President. I don't know what that vacuum will be, but it's not preposterous to suggest that we may have an occupying force in Baghdad for years, maybe a month, but a couple years. It's not preposterous to suggest that we will have a UN force, 95% of it made by the United States, to decide, do we go to war against Iran to prevent them from taking, quote, Iraqi oil fields? And our good friend, Mr. Assad. What can we expect from him in a post-conflict situation? The Syrians of Assad are always there. Well, Mr. President, a lot more to say about the substance or the wisdom or lack thereof of the present policy. But I truly don't believe in an argument about the use of force any other than in one area, and that is the constitutional question, not whether or not this body is willing to use force in the appropriate circumstance. The debate is, some of us like me think it's not the appropriate circumstance. Now, what's the hurry for war? What's the hurry? But the use of force is appropriate. For the remainder of my time, it's the issue I wish to speak to. The use of force is appropriate to just the constitutional sense. Rarely does the Senate find itself debating a matter because the Constitution of the United States of America demands that we do so. Today is one of those days. The Constitution, even if we wish not to, demands that we debate the question. We are here today because our Constitution, a document written by men who shed blood to free this land from tyranny of any one individual, commands the to decide the greatest question any country faces, and that is, should it go to war? Let there be no mistake about it, Mr. President. This is a question which the Congress, and only the Congress, can constitutionally answer. And at this point, the Constitution is as clear as it is plain. While Article 2 of the Constitution gives the President the power to command our troops, Article 1 of the Constitution commits Congress and the Congress alone the power to decide if this nation go to war. The framers of our Constitution took great pains to ensure that the government they established for us would differ from the rule of the British monarch. They knew firsthand of the consequences of leaving the choice between war and peace to one man. In England, the king alone could decide to take a nation to war, but in America, the federal papers tell us the power by the Constitution appertains to the legislature. As framer James Wilson assured those who fear the president's military power when they get to vote on the Constitution, and I quote, "It will not be in the power of any single man to invoke us in such distress, for the important power of deciding war is vested in the legislature at large." In light of this, Mr. President, it seems almost impossible to believe we're having a serious argument in this country today about whether, under the Constitution, the President alone can send the nation to war. The Constitutional language says that the war power is rests with Congress. But from James Madison to John Marshall, the Constitution's fathers were all understood this to be a key principle of the Republic. Ask anyone in this body or anyone listening wonder why I'm raising this question, since there's already a resolution before us. I'm raising it because the President continues to insist he does not need it. Does not need. The will of the people spoke through the Congress as envisioned by the Constitution to decide whether or not to go to war. I assume that means he would believe he had the constitutional authority, even if we vote down a resolution authorizing him to use force, to be able to use force. Whether he would politically do that or not is another question, but at least it should be somewhere on the record. But there is ample evidence, constitutional scholarship, to suggest that he has no such authority. On Tuesday, President Bush asked this Congress to debate and decide whether to take the nation to war. Yet unfortunately, the President stopped short of abandoning his previous claim that he has the power, acting alone, to start a war. His Secretary of Defense has said, as I quote, "We do not believe that the President requires any additional authorization from Congress before committing U.S. forces to achieve our objectives in the Gulf." The Secretary of State has said, and I quote, "The President has the right, as a matter of practice and principle, to initiate military action," end quote. And just yesterday, as I mentioned earlier, the President himself said that he alone has the constitutional authority to initiate war. No President before him has ever said anything like that. No President in our history has ever made such an assertion. To put it simply, these viewers are at odds with the Constitution. They may accurately describe the power of leaders of other countries, but they do not describe the power of the President of the United States. As one framer said at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, as he stood up, as we would say, I suspect today, if he heard Secretary of State and Defense make their comment, "I never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war." Yes, the President is the commander-in-chief, but in the framers' view, according to Alexander Hamilton, this amounts to, quote, "nothing more than the supreme command and direction of the military and naval forces," end of quote. In short, the Congress decides whether to make war, and the President decides how to make war. The meaning of the Constitution, in this case, clear, direct, and indisputable. Before President Bush launched an offensive action of 400,000 troops by anybody's standard of war, he must obtain a congressional authorization or declaration. It need not be a formal declaration of war, according to precedents and all the constitutional scholars, but it must be a clear, unambiguous authorization. To do less would be to flagrantly violate the very document that our troops are there sworn to uphold. This has been a view since the President's first deployment of U.S. troops in early August. In the support of the language of the Constitution, by the intentions of the framers, and by the history of our nation, and, I would add, most important, by the spirit of our democracy. In my view, the constitutional issue was strongly reinforced earlier this week. The Senate Judiciary Committee held the first congressional hearing to address questions of the President's authority under our Constitution to initiate military action against Iraq. At our hearing, we heard from distinguished constitutional scholars on the matter. Their testimony, I think, is enormously persuasive. In the words of former Attorney General Katzenbach, quote, unless the grant of Section 8 is to be ripped out of the Constitution entirely, the President is obliged to present circumstances to seek congressional approval for an attack to force Iraq out of Kuwait, end of quote. As Professor Lewis Lincoln, perhaps the nation's foremost expert in international law and the U.S. Constitution and a supporter of the UN resolution against Iraq, told the committee, and I quote, the President has no authority under the Constitution to take military action that would constitute going to war against Iraq unless he receives authorization from the Congress by a clear and unambiguous indication in advance, end of quote. Professor Henkin's statements reinforce other important points. Congressional silence in this field cannot be interpreted as assent to war. Under our Constitution, the President does not possess the power to launch a war unless the Congress stops him. That's not what it says. It rather says he has the power to command in a war only if the Congress chooses to launch one. As Professor William Alstein told the committee, the President, quote, may not loose dogs of war until Congress affirmatively authorizes it. It's just that simple, end of quote. As Professor Harold Coe of Yale put it, silence has a sound, and the sound is no, end of quote. Of course, I don't think Congress should remain silent. That's why we're here today. Indeed, since last August, I am calling for full congressional debate and a vote on this matter, as my friends in Massachusetts and others have since that time as well. This is not simply a constitutional requirement, but a political necessity. How can we remain silent on a great issue being debated around the country? How can we, and how can the President contemplate initiating military action of this magnitude without the clearly expressed support of the American people through their elected representatives? Without that support, whatever policy the President chooses, though wisdom or folly, cannot possibly succeed. The framers knew this, and that's why they delegated to us the power to choose between war and peace. The responsibility is awesome. The decision is difficult. There's a choice between what the Congress may prefer to avoid, but whatever our view on this ultimate decision, this is one on which all should agree. The decision whether or not to go to war rests to Congress. The overwhelming opinion of scholars and historians rests on the side. But the administration and a handful of scholars reject this constitutional command, and I want to briefly address their arguments to those who reject this notion. The arguments for presidential power fall into two categories, general and specific. The general arguments say that the President has the constitutional power to launch a military attack without congressional authorization under almost every conceivable circumstance, including this one. The specific arguments rely on particular aspects of this crisis to establish presidential authority. Let me consider them both in turn. The most general argument for presidential authority cites the President's power as commander-in-chief, and notes that in our history, military force is used over 200 times against foreign adversaries and only 5 times in the declaration of war. That's been mentioned time and again. Upon examination of the record, as I have and I hope as will, of those over 200 times, about 208 times, the record demonstrates that many of the 200 incidents were not attacks against sovereign nations, and that war could not have been declared. Others were mostly minor police actions to protect American property or citizens while they were abroad. Or others were sufficiently time urgent to fit under the rubric of the President's constitutional power to repel an attack. Or others were authorized by congressional enactment that served as de facto declarations of war, such as the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. To demonstrate the absurdity of this superficially appealing claim, let's give you one example of these 200 precedents cited by the President. In 1824, an American ship sent out a land party to Spanish possession of Cuba in pursuit of pirates. There can be no comparison pursuing pirates in the Spanish possession of Cuba by an American ship with what's going on today. Now develop and deploy a major portion of our air, naval, and land forces in the Gulf. Stand there for months. How anyone could deny that this would be significant military action, and not at all like the example I cited, and there are in that 208 such examples. I fail to understand. In sum, Mr. President, our constitutional tradition does not support the President's view, but rather just the opposite. And throughout our history, American presidents have acknowledged the proper division between their role and that of Congress. For example, when Thomas Jefferson considered launching a military assault on Spain, the Spanish, he wrote, and I quote, "Considering that Congress alone is constitutionally invested with power of changing the condition from peace to war, I have thought it my duty to await their authority for using force. Of course, force that belongs to the Congress exclusively, to yield or to deny." President James Buchanan put it similarly. Without the authority of Congress, he said, the President cannot fire a hostile gun in any case except to repel attacks by the enemy. End of quote. Perhaps because they knew that history is against them, the President's men have also said that the circumstances of modern warfare are such that extensive debate cannot reasonably precede the use of military force, lest the enemy be made aware of our intention. As a matter of fact, I drafted a document, as you may recall, Mr. President and others, suggesting that we explicitly state to the President before we adjourn the last Congress the authority he had and what he didn't have, what we were agreeing to and not agreeing to relative to the troops in the Gulf. The Secretary of State testified before our committee. He said, "No, you can't do that." I'm paraphrasing. "You will advance notice to the enemy of our intention if you said you could not use force until after a certain date." And then he went to the United Nations. Instead of having that be said here, it was appropriate to say it to the whole world. The UN then, under our leadership, passed a resolution that said you cannot use force until January 15th, after which you can. This argument that we don't have time to debate this issue clearly, in this case, was specious from the outset. Moreover, the mere fact that submitting this question to Congress is inconvenient, as in fact it is, does not in any way lessen the clarity of the constitutional command. The Supreme Court has, and I quote, "The fact that a given procedure is efficient, convenient, and useful in facilitating functions of the government will not save it if it is contrary to the Constitution. Convenience and efficiency are not the primary objectives or the hallmarks of a democratic government." The general argument for presidential authority to initiate war is profoundly misguided and deeply undemocratic. In the words again of Professor Henke said, this view is, quote, "without foundation in constitutional text, in original intent, or in our constitutional history." End quote. So much for the general claim that the President has the power to take the nation to war. Let me now briefly move to the specific arguments that are being made, relating to the current crisis, giving the President special authority. Nothing in the United Nations resolution on the Gulf crisis. Let's do another one. The President's proponents of his view that he has authority to move are now saying that the UN resolution in the Gulf, particularly Resolution 678, advocates that and allows, I should say, the President to use power because we ratified the UN Charter, which binds us to this resolution, and therefore provides the President with an independent authority to act under the UN auspices. That argument is now being made. The fact, Professor Eugene Rostow argued to the committee that the President's constitutional obligation is, quote, take care the laws of the United States are faithfully executed, including treaties, thereby, according to Mr. Rostow, encompasses a constitutional duty of the President to implement this resolution and gives him the power to do so without congressional consent. I understand the allure of this position. Many have long sought a stronger United Nations working for a new world order, want to see steps taken by the U.S. toward a new world order, receive a maximum amount of weight. Indeed, the UN resolutions are an important factor to be weighed as we begin our debate on this issue. While the UN resolutions do count as a foreign policy matter, they do not change in any way the constitutional calculus. As several witnesses told our committee, flaws of the contrary position are numerous. First, there is the question of whether any treaty, including the UN Charter, could in effect modify the Constitution. Second, even the President and the Senate could enter into treaties that would give the President a power to take the nation to war. The question is the UN Charter such treaty? And the answer clearly is no, even if we could do it. Moreover, even if our ratification of the UN Charter in 1945 gave the President additional powers to go to war under the UN Charter, Congress changed that provision very early under U.S. law. For the Act states in 1973 stated through the War Powers Act, authority to introduce U.S. armed forces into hostilities shall not be inferred from any treaty heretofore ratified. Asking consent to the rest of the argument, I'd like to ask on that point be entered in the record as if read. Thus, the so-called UN argument for the President's power, I think, can be dismissed in this way. Even if the ratification of a treaty could give the President added war power, which I doubt, and the UN Charter as ratified did make this change, which it did not, and Congress accepted this view, which it expressly rejected in 1973. The fact is that in the current crisis, the UN has done nothing to oblige our President to take any action with respect to military force. The choice to go to war remains with the Congress and the Congress alone, as it always was. So it has been since the earliest days of our republic, and so it is today. And so hopefully it always will be, as long as this country is governed by a constitution. In closing, Mr. President, I would like to point out a terrible irony to the debate over the constitutional issue of discussion here today. Stop and think about the President's rationale for war. As I understand it, is at least in part, that Iraq has violated the law of nations through his heinous invasion of Kuwait, and that we must set a precedent for a new world order, one based on law. Fair enough. But then let's just ask this question. Is the President prepared to pursue this same objective here at home? Soon 400,000 soldiers will be in the Saudi desert. Most are there now. American men and women are preparing to fight and die if necessary to preserve our life as the President uses it, or to reverse aggression, as it is less grandiosely phrased, to uphold the law of nations and to inaugurate a new world order. If the President, in his statements, appears willing to violate our Constitution to achieve those objectives, if this crisis is really about upholding the law of nations, I suggest the President acknowledge that he starts here by upholding the law at home, clearly acknowledge that only the Congress can take this nation to war. Americans once lived under a system where one man had the unfettered choice to decide for himself whether we would go to war. We launched a revolution to free ourselves from a similar system. And failure by the Congress to discharge our constitutional role, to insist that the choice about war be made by us, not by the President, would be a mistake of historic proportion. As Professor Van Alstyne passionately told the committee yesterday, and I quote, if Congress in this instance cannot now reclaim its own constitutional integrity, then this is the constitutional moment. Not Kuwait, not the Civil War. This is the one that will serve as the monument to the future. The Congress will have collaborated in the collapse of the separation of powers under the Constitution of the United States. End of quote. Madam President, no warning can be put starkly, and I think no statement state our Constitution should be more clearly. And let me close by saying, the reason I bring this up is that I thought it had been obviated to me to discuss this issue. We announced hearings. The President, subsequent to that, having nothing to do with our announcement of hearings, said he was to seek congressional approval. And so since made this point. But then the President, even after sending up a resolution, insisted that he did not need to do it. And I raised this issue only to point out, if perchance a majority of the Senate votes as I will, to continue sanctions and not America resort to war, not giving him the authority, then he must understand, we must be clear if that occurs, the President has no authority to go to war. Every constitutional scholar who testified, even those who suggest he could go to war now in the absence of a congressional authorization, acknowledge that if we know he has no authority to do so, separate and apart from our control over the purse strings. That's the reason I raised today. With permission of the Senate, I will speak to the floor tomorrow to speak to the merits or lack thereof of the President's policy as to whether or not and which resolution we should vote for. I thank my
Senator, the Senator from Missouri.
Madam President, like all my colleagues, I have been engaged in intense soul-searching on how I vote on the question now before the Senate, whether to support the President if he determines forces necessary to expel Iraq from Kuwait. Throughout this soul-searching, two convictions have been foremost in my mind. I'm convinced beyond doubt that the United States must not allow the status quo in Kuwait to stand. Some have argued that the President has not made a clear case for America's insistence that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait. But for me, the President's case is both crystal clear and overwhelmingly convincing. This is the first major test of the post-Cold War world order. With the recent collapse of the Soviet Empire, the great threat we have feared since 1945 is no longer real. The likelihood is zero that the Soviet Union will precipitate war by invading Western Europe. But the events of August 7th have demonstrated to all that to be rid of one threat does not make the world safe. A growing list of countries now possesses or soon will possess the instruments of mass destruction. One of those countries is Iraq. It is simply not sufficient to check the possibility of terrifying aggression at one of its sources. We must be prepared to check terrifying aggression at all of its sources. Kuwait, Iraq is the aggressor, but its actions cannot be tolerated. Surely all of us agree on this point. Iraq attacked its neighbors, occupied its territory, and brutalized its people. It has fielded a massive army with chemical, biological warfare capability, but it has no compunctions about use. It now controls 20% of the world's proven oil reserves, and if undeterred, it could control an additional 25% of world reserves in Saudi Arabia by conquest or intimidation. Some people have asked whether this conflict is not, quote, just about oil. To me, that is like asking whether it is just about oxygen. Like it or not, our country, together with the rest of the world, is utterly dependent on oil. Our economy, our jobs, our ability to defend ourselves are dependent on our access to oil. To control the world's supply of oil, is, in a real sense, to control the world. So what is involved in the Persian Gulf today? It's not only the preservation of world order and the prevention of brutal aggression. It is the vital economic and security interests of the United States and the rest of the world as well. For many years, commentators of various philosophical stripes, especially liberal commentators, argued that the United States should not go it alone in the world. We should not take it upon ourselves to be the world policeman. So the commentators have argued with respect to Central America and elsewhere that our country should not act unilaterally. We should work with other countries. We should address crises on a multilateral basis. This is exactly what President Bush has done with respect to the present crisis. It has gone repeatedly to the United Nations Security Council for approval of concerted action. He and Secretary of State Baker have consulted incessantly with countries throughout the world. He has asked for and received the military economic support of more than 30 nations. And he has widely acclaimed, especially by the liberals, for this multilateral approach. Now it is argued that while many nations have done something, few nations have done enough. I suppose this point will always be made no matter what the degree of commitment by our partners. But what are we to make of such an argument? That multilateralism was a mistake after all? That no matter how assiduously pursued, it never really works? The advocates of multilateralism cannot have it both ways. They cannot applaud it one day and jeer at it the next. Would that there were more leaders of the free world. But the fact is that the United States is the leader. We are the one remaining world power. And if the United States now retreats from its commitment, from joint effort, on the ground that others are not as strong or as firm as we are, all the effort to seek Security Council resolution and to consult with other governments will have an exercise of futility recognized as such throughout the world. The captain cannot abandon the ship. Having gained the approval of so many other governments, some of which are on the very border of Iraq and in great peril for their survival, it is unthinkable that our government could now lose its will. Having urged the world to approve combined action, it is not an option for the Congress of the United States to disapprove what we for months have asked others to support. This, then, is my first conviction. We cannot accept Iraq's occupation of Kuwait. My second conviction is that war with Iraq would be a disaster we should do everything to avoid. I have believed, and I do believe, that the negative consequences of war far outweigh the positive. These negatives have totally consumed my thinking, and I have expressed them to the President and to key members of his administration. I foresee many casualties: the use of chemical weapons by Iraq, terrorist strikes, Israel's involvement, long-lasting turmoil in the Middle East. Repeatedly, I ask myself the same question. When we win the war, what happens? What happens to the balance of power in the Middle East, to the governments of Iraq, to the stability of friendly governments in Egypt and Saudi Arabia? Repeatedly, I have come to the same answer. While the status quo is unacceptable, the alternative of war is even worse. Because of this conclusion, I have for some time believed that if I had to vote on the matter, I'd vote against authorizing the President to use military force. I've taken comfort in the proposition that we will soon be voting on here in the Senate. Let's give sanctions a chance to work. Madam President, after consulting with the best advice I could find, I have concluded that there is no comfort to be found in the proposition. It is clear to me that sanctions alone cannot reverse the status quo. Sanctions alone will cause suffering to the civilian population of Iraq. They will not force the Iraqi army from Kuwait. And causing suffering to a civilian population without military result should never be the objective of a civilized nation. I refer the Senate, as others have today, to the public testimony of Director of Central Intelligence Webster before the House Armed Services Committee December 5, 1990, and I ask unanimous consent, as others have, Madam President, that a transcript of that testimony be included in the record at this point.
Without objection, so ordered.
The conclusion of Director Webster is that sanctions in themselves will not lead to the overthrow of Saddam Hussein, and that they will not lead to him to change his policy in Kuwait. The director states that if Saddam Hussein decides to withdraw from Kuwait, that decision, and I quote, will be determined by his total assessment of political, economic, and military pressures arrayed against him. It is my privilege to serve on the Select Committee on Intelligence. I am precluded, of course, from divulging classified information I received in briefings given that committee. However, I am free to state my own conclusions on the basis of the total understanding. My conclusion is this: standing by themselves and without the credible threat of military force, sanctions have no chance of expelling Iraq from Kuwait. Some have argued that sanctions would, over time, weaken Iraq's military position and make an eventual conflict less costly to American forces. But this assumption is not borne out by the best available advice, including Director Webster's public testimony. The director states, quote, under non-combat conditions, Iraqi ground and air forces can probably maintain near current levels of readiness for as long as 9 months. He further states that the Iraqi Air Force would feel the effects of sanctions to a greater degree than ground forces, which are more immune to sanctions. But it is ground forces that have dug into Kuwait in massive numbers, and it has been said that ground forces have never been defeated by air superiority alone. Now, Madam President, I know that there have been various interpretations offered in the Senate about exactly what Director Webster said in his testimony on December 5th. It could be said that he testified sanctions work. Madam President, if the meaning of work is to inflict pain on civilians, that conclusion is absolutely correct. But there is no way to read the testimony of Director Webster on December 5th and come out with the conclusion that the sanctions offer any possibility of removing Iraq from Kuwait in the foreseeable future. I'd like to just a few excerpts from the letter that Director Webster has written today to Chairman Aspen of the House Armed Services Committee. These are the words of William Webster. Characterizing his testimony of December, he says, I also testified that there was no evidence that sanctions would mandate a change in Saddam Hussein's behavior, and that there was no evidence when or even if they would force him out of Kuwait. And then the director goes on and says this: the ability of the Iraqi ground forces to defend defend Kuwait and southern Iraq is unlikely to be substantially eroded over the next 6 to 12 months, even if effective sanctions be maintained. This is especially true if Iraq does not believe a coalition attack is likely during this period. Iraq's infantry and artillery forces, the key element of Iraq's initial defense, probably would not suffer significantly as a result of sanctions. Iraq can easily maintain the relatively simple Soviet-style weaponry of its infantry and artillery units and can produce virtually all of the ammunition for these forces domestically. Moreover, these forces will have additional opportunity to extend and reinforce their fortifications along the Saudi border, thereby increasing their defensive strength. The director then says, on balance, marginal decline of combat power in Baghdad's armored units probably would be offset by the simultaneous improvement of its defensive fortifications. Of course, the director says Iraq's air force and air defenses are likely to be hit far more severely than its army if effective sanctions are maintained for another 6 to 12 months. This degradation will diminish Iraq's ability to defend its strategic assets from air attacks and reduce its ability to conduct similar attacks on its neighbors. It will have only a marginal impact on Saddam's ability to hold Kuwait and southern Iraq. The Iraqi Air Force is not likely to play a major role in any battle for Kuwait. Our judgment remains, says the director, that even if sanctions continue to be enforced for an additional 6 to 12 months, economic hardship alone is unlikely to compel Saddam to retreat from Kuwait or cause regime-threatening popular discontent in Iraq. So is time on our side, Madam President? I have long wanted to believe. I cannot persuade myself that this was more than wishful thinking on my part. What happens for the next 9 months or a year or more than a year as we vainly wait for the Iraqis to leave their fortifications? Do we keep more than 400,000 troops in place through Ramadan, through the Hajj, through the summer? And if so, what happens to their readiness, their support by the American people, their acceptance by the Muslim masses? To ask questions is to answer them. To wait for sanctions to work is to wait while we get weaker and Iraq bides its time. The one and only chance to accomplish our objectives without war is to maintain sanctions accompanied by a credible military threat. Without a credible military threat, our alternative is sanctions followed by nothing at all. The key to peace is maintaining a credible military threat. And this is precisely the point our pending bills will address. Those who would give sanctions a chance before military action is even possible would decouple the two components which must be kept linked if we have any chance of getting Iraq out of Kuwait without a fight. They would foreclose any possibility of a peace. This is why I cannot vote sanctions alone. This is why I cannot vote to deprive the President of the credible threat of war. It is indeed a supreme irony. It is only through the threat of force that a stable world can be maintained. But that is irony we have recognized ever since World War II. Madam President, I do believe Saddam Hussein paid attention to what we do and say in the Senate. I do believe the President's credibility is our best hope if we are to preserve a stable world without war. We will soon vote to enhance that credibility or to undercut it. I will support the President with my vote and with my prayers.
President?
The senator from Rhode Island, the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Mr. President, the vote that we soon take is about the most momentous that any member of Congress must cast. It's a distinguished vote for many of us. Voting whether to commit young American men and women to battle. Under our Constitution, it's the Congress that must make this decision. And in this debate, we at last must face up to our responsibilities in connection with the Persian Gulf crisis. In this regard, my present view is that while force will eventually be necessary, and I see myself voting in support of such force, I know that it is not my view at this time. Over our nation's 100-year history, generations of Americans have been called upon to serve our country in the defense of our territory, our people, and our values. Many of us in this body have served in the cause of freedom in World War II, Korea, Vietnam. Hundreds of thousands of young men and women have in our lifetime been killed, made the supreme sacrifice for our country. Respect that sacrifice and believe we best honor our fallen countrymen by being absolutely certain that no future young Americans need die unless absolutely necessary. I do believe it's time to commit American forces to battle in the Persian Gulf now, at this time. We have in place today a strategy of international sanctions, military deployment that can, and in my judgment, will accomplish our objectives in the Persian Gulf. Those objectives are the defense of Saudi Arabia and other friendly regional nations, security of world energy supplies, the liberation of Kuwait, and the punishment of aggression. With nearly 400,000 servicemen in the Persian Gulf, we have more than adequate force to defeat totally an Iraqi attack on Saudi Arabia. Let's remember that to defend Saudi Arabia, not to resist the occupation of Kuwait, that President Bush made the original deployments of United States forces to Saudi Arabia. Deployments that were supported by virtually every member of the U.S. Congress. We have in place a strategy of economic and financial sanctions aimed at forcing Iraq to withdraw from Kuwait. Sanctions mandated by United Nations Security Council Resolution 61, being honored by almost every nation. The UN Security Council has given them its authority to enforce the embargo through a naval blockade, and the United States is one of a number of countries participating in an international force to deny Iraq access to maritime commerce. As a result of the UN sanctions, Iraq can sell no oil. It can perform no financial transactions. Iraq's gross national product has fallen between 40 and 50% in just 4 months. Spare parts, imported inputs, foreign technicians, Iraq would operate most of the expensive infrastructure that it purchased in the oil boom years of the 1960s and the 1970s. Iraq cannot manufacture plants for its transport. It was soon unable to produce certain kinds of lubricants or to refine high-quality aviation oil fuel. Even more important, the sanctions are beginning to erode Iraq's military potential. Without spare parts, it cannot fly airplanes, replace its artillery, or maintain its tanks. The United States replaces its helicopter engine every 50 hours of flying time in the desert. Iraq will replace its helicopter engine. I believe sanctions will eventually force Saddam Hussein to withdraw from Kuwait, or on the alternative, would eventually force Iraqi people to replace him. I concede, though, that sanctions might not produce an Iraqi withdrawal. If force does become necessary, I want us men and women to enter battle facing the best possible odds. And that's not the case right now. But at the time, I believe sanctions will improve the odds in favor of the armed forces as compared with the degrading Iraqi military machine. But I believe we owe it to our young men and women to give them the best possible advantage. Some have suggested that this debate is a partisan one, that Republicans are more interested in getting Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait while Democrats seek to get George Bush out of the White House. 2.5 years ago, I stood at the Senate floor as the author of the Prevention of Genocide Act, the bill to impose comprehensive sanctions on Iraq for its use of poison gas for its very own Kurdish minority. More than 20,000 innocent women, children, and men died as a result of a violation of international law and human decency, less serious, the seizure of Kuwait. Yet the Reagan administration vehemently, vigorously opposed sanctions against Iraq then. And even a week before the president invaded Kuwait, the Bush administration strongly opposed the sanctions bill, co-authored by Senator D'Amato and myself. I couldn't help but observe that those who are most enthusiastic about committing United States forces to battle against Iraq now are those who were most vocally opposed to sanctions prior to August the 2nd. The debate is not about objectives. Absolutely united in our goals. Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait. Aggression must not be rewarded. Our difference is simply one of tactics. Do we continue our effective sanctions policy, or do we seek on using force right now, without ever knowing if the sanctions would have worked, and without ever giving our servicemen and women the benefit of the doubt, without ever giving our servicemen and women the benefit of the weakest possible Iraqi foe? Nor is the debate about politics. There's an honest difference of opinion about the best course of action for our nation. As amongst those who served our country in war, and one who was pressed in the United States Senate for the toughest possible non-military response to years of Iraqi law building, I believe that at this time, peace, the continuation of comprehensive sanctions, is the wisest course, strongest course, the best course for our nation.
The senator from New York.
Mr. President, if I might consider why the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee is still on the floor to make an observation. Is absolutely correct as it relates to the failure of the administration and this Congress repeatedly take any kind of action to cut off trade with Saddam Hussein. We're more interested in the profits than what's taking place to the people, to the slaughter of the innocent, the use of poison gas. I commend my colleague for his steadfastness, purpose, for his commitment, and his attempt early on to wake people up to what was taking place. Absolutely correct. Mr. President, notwithstanding my admiration of my colleague from Rhode Island, his sense of justice and purpose, I have to think that the resolutions that have been indicated are to be considered. The joint resolution that was submitted today by the majority leader and others is one that I think will do terrible harm to our country. To put it succinctly, it rewards Saddam Hussein and it gives a slap in the face to our president and the people. It undercuts the United States at a time when we should be sending Saddam Hussein a message that we are committed to seeing that he is away. It does away with the chance and opportunity to end this conflict, and it is a conflict, and it is a struggle, peacefully. Only when Saddam Hussein understands that there is a very real threat of the elimination of those things important to him being able to sustain himself, we have an opportunity for victory. And victory is bringing about freedom for the people of Kuwait, and yet establishing order so that the region, so important to the stability of world peace, can be freed from that kind of military machine. This is Congress at its worst. And I can't believe my colleagues, after studying the record, after looking at the facts as it relates to sanctions, can say, let's give sanctions more time. More time for what? So that 6 months from now we'll come back here, we'll face a situation with less support for standing up to Saddam Hussein's aggression throughout the world than we have today. If you think that our allies are shirking their responsibility and making contributions to this war effort, and I'm talking about the Japanese, the Germans, the French, and the Saudis, what makes you think that 6 months from now our contributions will be, well, that shirking is even greater?
will the burden on American families be even greater? No, Madam President, I think that this is a terrible situation. I think that this is the end of bipartisanship as it reflects on our foreign policy. This resolution is nothing short, again, of a blow to our president, to our young men and women out there in Saudi Arabia. It will blow to everything that we stand for. It says that we don't have the trust and confidence in our president when to use force if he deems necessary. But somehow we, the Senate of the United States, we know better when that force can and should be used. This isn't a constitutional debate about a declaration of war. This is the Congress that must stand up and make a decision whether force shouldn't be used, saying, notwithstanding, if the president feels he needs that authority so that he's credible, says to Saddam Hussein, you must leave. Otherwise, we can and will use force necessary. But Congress says, no, we have waited long enough. I don't know when the United States needs its stability more than now. And it's not too late for us to give our president that authority. And I believe when he has that authority, we have a better opportunity to ending this deadly, deadly undertaking without the use of force. If we want peace, let's give our president the ability to sustain and make it known that he has the ability to carry out those promises and those undertakings that he's made. Those assurances that he's given to our allies, and yet those warnings that he's given to our enemies.
The senior senator from Massachusetts.
Mr. President, the debate we begin today is a watershed in the modern history of the Senate and the nation. The choice between war and peace is the most important decision that any nation ever makes. And the votes to come may be the most important votes that any of us ever cast. The lives of thousands of American and allied forces are hanging in the balance, as are the lives of thousands of innocent civilians in the Middle East. The course that America takes the next few days may well affect the stability of that region of the world for years or even generations to come. 2 days ago, President Bush asked Congress to support the use of all necessary means to implement the Security Council resolution on the Persian Gulf. For all practical purposes, President Bush is asking Congress, as must under the Constitution, for authority to take this country into war after the January 15th deadline of the UN resolution. I urge the Senate to vote for peace, not war. Now is not time for war. I reject the argument that says Congress must support the president, right or wrong. We have our own responsibility to do what is right, and I believe war today is wrong. War is not the only option left to us in the Persian Gulf. The president may have set January 15th as his deadline, but the American people have not. Sanctions and diplomacy may still achieve our objectives, and Congress has a responsibility to ensure that all peaceful options are exhausted before resort to war. Unless we reach that stage, Congress ought not to authorize the president to use force. This historic moment, it may well be that only Congress stop this senseless march towards war. There is broad support in Congress for the goals of the United Nations resolution. All of us share the disappointment that yesterday's meeting between Secretary Baker and Foreign Minister Aziz failed to make progress towards a peaceful settlement. But the world has gone the last mile of peace, and we have not reached the last resort of war. The Secretary General of the United Nations, President Quasar, will meet with Saddam Hussein on Saturday. President Bush, France, European community, Syria, and other narrative nations are still testing avenues for peace. No one knows whether any of their efforts can succeed. No one can predict what moves the unpredictable Saddam Hussein will make. I reject the good cop, bad cop theory. The more belligerent the United States threatens war, the more likely its other diplomatic initiatives will succeed. In fact, I believe it represents the worst kind of brinkmanship that only makes war more likely. The resolution offered today by Majority Mitchell is the wisest course of peace. The American people stand united in opposing Saddam Hussein. They are unwavering in their commitment to the goals of the immediate, complete, and unconditional withdrawal of all Iraqi forces from Kuwait and the restoration of peace and security in the Persian Gulf. But America is deeply divided on whether war at this time and on President Bush's timetable is the only way to accomplish these goals. We have given peace a chance, but we have not given peace enough chance. President Bush has gone to great lengths to emphasize if we go to war, it will not be another Vietnam-type war. But the president has missed the great lesson from that tragic war, that it is a grave mistake to take a divided America into war. Unless and until the American people support a war with Iraq, Congress has no business authorizing war. The world's response to Iraq's uncomfortable invasion of Kuwait is unprecedented. Never before have the nations of the world come together so quickly, so overwhelmingly, and so decisively in opposition to aggression. If ever there was an example of the new world order of which the President speaks, this is it. It makes no sense to risk all that we have achieved in the name of peace by a premature resort to war. Yet, with no meaningful consultation with Congress, the President unilaterally decided on November 8th to move away from a sensible policy that had stopped Iraq in its tracks and that was working effectively to achieve the goals of the United States and the world community without the need for war. 2 days after the November elections, President Bush inexplicably declared his policy of deterrence. When sanctions have failed, abandoned Operation Shield and took up Operation Desert War. The confrontation in the Gulf was initially the world against Iraq. But since November 8th, because of the high news atmosphere created by President Bush, the conflict has become increasingly America against Iraq. And if the shooting starts, it will be almost entirely America against Iraq. Our policy went off track November 8th. That is no justification for Congress to ratify now. Giving peace a realistic chance was the best course for America in the world before November 8th, and it's still the best course on January 15th. There is time for Congress to insist that sanctions and diplomacy given the full and fair opportunity to work that they deserve before Congress takes the fateful step of authorizing the President to send American men and women to die in the war in the Persian Gulf. Sanctions have not failed, and no one can prove they have. They still have a good chance of achieving our objectives in the Gulf. Saddam Hussein is paying a heavy price for his aggression. 95 to 97% of his oil exports are shut down. Iraq's economy has been cut nearly in half. Saddam has no foreign exchange to prime his war machine. The trickle of consumer goods may be slipping through. Saddam cannot reach his country or his war machine on that. Saddam still occupies Kuwait oil fields. They're worthless to him. He invaded Kuwait to boost his oil revenues, but instead is losing $1.5 billion a month. His earnings from oil are now zero, and that's no minor achievement. The sanctions are having unparalleled success in squeezing up. There is no reason to abandon now. We will have an excellent chance of using them to achieve all our objectives without shedding the blood of thousands of American troops. Let there be no mistake about the cost of war. We have arranged an impressive international coalition against Iraq. But when the bullets start flying, 90% of the casualties will be American. It is hardly a surprise that so many other nations are willing to fight to the left American to achieve the goals of the United Nations. It is their sons and daughters who will do dying. Most military experts tell us that a war with Iraq will not be quick and decisive, as President Bush suggests. It'll be brutal and costly. It'll take weeks and months and quickly turn from an air war into a ground war with thousands, perhaps even tens of thousands of American casualties. The administration refuses to release casualty estimates. But the 44,000 body bags the Pentagon has sent to the region are all the evidence we need of the high price in lives and blood that we will spared. Military experts have used Israel's two recent desert wars as reliable indicators of the casualties we will suffer. In the Six-Day War in 1967, Israel suffered 3,300 casualties out of a force of 3,000, including 7,000 dead. In the heavier fight that lasted 20 days in the 1973 war, Israel casualties were 11,000, a force of a similar size of 2,600 dead. In other words, we're talking about the likelihood of at least 3,000 American casualties a week with 700 dead for as long as the war goes on. Perhaps President Bush was correct that a war with Saddam will end in days, not weeks or months. But what if he is wrong? There is little doubt that even the quickest victory will come at a high cost in American lives. We must also be concerned about the unpredictable impact of war on the rest of the region in terms of our vital interests. Minister Aziz bluntly said that Iraq will attack Israel, absolutely attack, war begins. No one knows what will happen if Israel responds with massive retaliation against Iraq. No one can predict the impact of a massive American attack of American bombs killing thousands of Iraqi civilians if the president decides to bomb Baghdad or other cities to achieve our objectives. As Vietnam proved, there is no such thing as a surgical strike. Finally, there is the issue of the Constitution. Throughout the crisis, the administration contended that President Bush has all the authority he needs to order U.S. troops into war against Iraq without the approval of Congress. That position is wrong, dead wrong, and not a single American should die because of it. No president, to be as faithful to the Constitution and the fundamental principles of our democracy, has the right to send U.S. troops into war without the approval of Congress. The current debate has been made of so-called 200 past incidents in which the United States has sent troops abroad with a declaration of war. The overwhelming majority of these past incidents were not wars at all. Most were brief expeditions to protect U.S. citizens in danger or to attack pirates, bandits, not wars against foreign nations. None of these cases resembles the unprecedented situation in the Persian Gulf, 400,000 American troops now just on the brink of war. Only our times before this century has the United States made a large-scale commitment to send U.S. troops overseas to combat another nation. World War I, World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Both world wars were authorized by congressional declaration of war. The massive U.S. buildup in Vietnam was authorized by the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. In the case of Korea, President Truman ordered U.S. troops to South Korea less than a week after the invasion. All the assault by the North Koreans was still underway. Even before the troops arrived, Congress expressed its support for the president's action by voting to extend the draft. Really, no one challenged Mr. Bush's decision to send U.S. troops to the Persian Gulf last August to prevent Iraq from overrunning Saudi Arabia after its brutal invasion of Kuwait. But the circumstances now are entirely different. And President Bush must have the authority of Congress before he can go to war. Fortunately, President Bush has now at least partially acquiesced in what the Constitution so obviously requires. He has asked Congress for authority to go to war, although he continues to insist that he does not need any such authority. And it is by no means clear that he will abide by a vote in Congress that denies him such authority. I hope that in the course of this debate in Congress, someone on behalf of the Bush administration will cite the constitutional argument which the President says he is relying on, which he claims he needs no additional authority from Congress to go to war. The administration chose not to send a witness to speak that case in hearings held by the Judiciary Committee last Tuesday. A strong impression left by that hearing was that the administration has no creditable argument to make because its position can stand the light of day. All of us hope that war with Iraq can be avoided. But if not, the hundreds of thousands of American men and women who will risk their lives in such a war deserve to know that the Constitution they are trying to protect has been abandoned. If not, we are no better than the dictators that we are opposing. Strict adherence to the Constitution and to the democratic values that it represents has never been more important than at this crucial and defining moment in our history. If we allow President Bush to start a war without prior congressional approval, it will haunt us for years to come. When President Truman seized the nation's steel mills during the Korean War, the Supreme Court ruled that he had acted unconstitutionally. The court struck down his action. Justice Jackson wrote, "They say that power to legislate for emergency belongs to the hands of Congress. But only Congress itself can prevent power from slipping through its fingers. In sum, all Americans want to see Saddam Hussein out of Kuwait. There is no division on that issue. The question that before us is not whether to achieve that objective, but how. No one wants to undercut the president. War is at stake for that. America should not go to war simply because President Bush set an unreal deadline that closed off real possibilities for peace. Under the Constitution, the decision is ours to make, not his. No course is easy or without cost. But we have a responsibility to decide which course best protects American interests and American lives. Persuasive peaceful war cannot be made. Let's continue the sanctions, continue our diplomacy until all peaceful options have been clearly exhausted. And then and only then Congress authorized President Bush to take this nation to war. As Robert Frost wrote long ago in The Road Taken, a poem that speaks for the ages, that speaks to us now, two roads diverged in a wood. And I took the one less people by, and that made all the difference. In the course of human events, peace often seeks the road less traveled by. But it is the road we ought to take today, and it may well make all the difference.
President.
The senator from New Jersey.
Madam President, the most serious issue a senator must ever decide involves war and peace. In the Persian Gulf crisis, we have three choices. Never use force to break Iraq's seizure and occupation of Kuwait, make war now, or continue economic sanctions while keeping open the possibility of war later. Among these three choices, I choose the third course. Most people do not know how we got to where we are today. Put bluntly, 20 years the United States has ignored and excused Saddam Hussein's ruthless and tyrannical actions. We cannot escape the fact that beginning in 1975, the Ford administration stood silent while the regime Saddam helped create made war its own Kurdish citizens, as it had done earlier against Iraqi Shias and Druze. We can't escape the fact the Carter administration, preoccupied with Iran as the source of evil in the Middle East, nodded when Saddam Hussein invaded that nation for territory and oil. And we cannot escape the fact that the conduct of our policy toward Iraq by Presidents Reagan and Bush from the end of the war with Iran to the moment of his invasion in August encouraged Saddam to believe, incorrectly, that we could turn a similar blind eye to an Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. We were expected that he would take all Kuwait. The former U.S. ambassador has said, in explaining why she told Saddam that we had no opinion on Arab-Arab disputes. 10 years ago, the Carter administration officials never expected that Saddam would try to make all of Khuzestan, the oil-rich province of Iran, populated by Arabs. In 1980, we were truly taken by surprise. In 1990, it was a serious diplomatic blunder. But when Saddam went ahead and seized all of Kuwait in August, I supported the American response. No longer would we turn a blind eye to Saddam's evil acts of brutish opportunism. His aggression would be countered. President Bush said our goals clearly, persuaded nearly every civilized nation to endorse those goals. We would act to deter further advance by Iraqi troops towards Saudi Arabia with sufficient military force to hold them back and attack them by air. We would isolate Iraq from the international economic system with sanctions to deny him markets for his export oil, to freeze his foreign financial assets, and to deny his access to spare parts and supplies on which his military machine depends. Above all, we sent the message to Saddam Hussein that we would be patient and steadfast in our insistence that he must leave Kuwait if he ever wished to rejoin the community of nations. Saddam Hussein might try to gamble that America and the coalition would lose its patience. But we were so united in early fall, at home, abroad,